Alrighty, howdy, gents. Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for coming in
Hey.
today. Um, so usually I wanted to do like the introductions for people, but I thought it would just be best if you introduce yourselves because I don't want to get something wrong. So introduce yourselves, Si. Go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna go top down. Yeah, sure. So I am Sai. I've been playing WoW since vanilla. I switched to Druid from Hunter in Burning Crusade, and I played every Druid spec for the whole, all the way up until Legion. And then I never played Feral. I finally swapped to Feral in Legion because I thought, hey, Feral always performs pretty well eventually. Instead of going Boomkin, I'll go Feral. And so it just so happens for the last two expansions, Feral's been dog, and yeah, now I'm kind of stuck in it. So yeah, I'm a Feral main. Obviously, my focus is kind of Mythic Plus really, and I do raids, but I much more enjoy the continuous kind of Mythic Plus scene. And yeah, that's me. That's me.
All right, guilty.
I'm guilty as. A few of you might know me already. I'm active in Dreamgrove Discord. I write the Wowhead guide. I record Cat Chat intermittently, even though we promised it would be monthly. It's not. And I currently raid in Pure on Thralion, where I sometimes press buttons and do numbers. And I would like to ask my raid leader to not take anything I say here against me.
Okay.
It's all filthy lies.
Look at this guy with actual qualifications, writing guides and appearing on things.
God.
Unbelievable.
Yep.
All right, gents. Well, good to meet you. I suppose meet you at this point. So just like with the other shows, and I know we talked a bit ahead of the show, and you guys have the doc. I think the best place to really start is just to kind of give a brief history leading up to why we're here, where we are with Feral. Have things substantially changed, etc. At the start of starting from Legion, because Legion is when kind of Blizzard did their whole let's take all 36 specs and redesign them or try to redesign them or kind of infuse some love into them. I'm not really sure off the top of my head if Feral got anything substantial at the time, but if they did, why don't you let us know?
So Feral didn't get a huge amount of changes, like as I've mentioned before. Feral's basically been the same spec for the last decade or so, with a few small adjustments here and there. But Brutal Slash came by in Legion, and Jagged Wounds, obviously. Jagged Wounds sort of being the main driver of the sort of Legion spinning plates playstyle that everyone sort of associates with Feral and associates with Legion Feral. But for the most part, it didn't have a whole lot of changes. It was kind of the same spec that it's always been. You maintain Rip, you maintain Rake, and you press Ferocious Bite. So,
How can you improve upon perfection? Am I right?
I'm sure there's many
No.
ways.
No changes.
get into that?
Yeah,
so-
we had a few things in. Yeah, sorry, you get it.
Fire away, my man.
I was just gonna say, yeah, we had a few things kind of come into the fray with Legion. Like, obviously, the addition of legendaries helped. Like, I mean, you're mentioning the kind of that spinning plates style build, but the benefit of having legendaries, like the energy increasing legendary, where I think we gain like what an extra 100 energy. So it just means that like pooling element, an aspect of Feral, is made easier, and we had Ashmane's Frenzy come into the fray with the artifact weapon, and so a few things that kind of spiced up our kit, I guess. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
What was the spinning plate build? Sorry for feral nubs like myself.
So basically, at the start of Legion, you played a build which composed of Blood Talons, Savage Roar, Lunar Inspiration, which is Moonfire, and Jagged Wounds. And what Jagged Wounds does is it compressed your bleed durations by 33%.
Okay.
So they ticked faster, so it just had shorter duration. So it was just a case of sort of, people described it as spinning plates because there was a lot of stuff you had to balance. You had to maintain your Rip, you had to maintain your Moonfire, you had to maintain the snapshots and all that. And you had to maintain Savage Roar on top of all of that. So there was sort of a lot of plates going on you had to keep tending to.
Yeah, it was a
I
lot
think
of thinking ahead of time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Like playing
Yes.
10, 15 seconds ahead of time, and you have Savage Roar at like 20 seconds left, and you're like, oh, nice. And
Yeah.
you're like, oh, wait, actually, no, I have to refresh that in a second. Like, it was hectic.
So yeah, people just described it as spinning plates.
And near the last spec standing of the great snapshotting era, of World of Warcraft, pretty much, right? With
I don't think
Yeah.
Blizzard likes snapshotting. I think they try and move away from it because I don't know, is it like difficult to balance or something because you have so many, I guess, like multipliers and whatnot. So I feel like they try and limit it these days.
I feel like it was.
We are the last spec remaining. Yeah.
I feel like it was probably just too easy to. I don't know. Well, abuse is not the right word. I know some people miss it, some people don't miss it. But it was very easy for some classes that were multi-daughters to take massive advantage of, like
Yes.
Affliction and Feral. You just pop everything and then just never let your dot drop, and then good luck beating that guy on DPS kind of thing.
Yeah. Had a load of variants. Personally, I liked it, but I can see how it was difficult for Blizzard to balance around it. It's something that you always have to think about if it exists. So it's just easier for Blizzard if it doesn't exist.
Was there not a point in Legion that you guys were? I mean, I don't want to say good as in like you've been trashed forever. We'll talk about community perception and all that kind of stuff later. But where you were like quite favorable, like higher up on the melee totem pole, so to speak.
Yeah, I think for most of Legion we were sort of upper middle of the pack in terms of actual sort of numerical throughputs. Like Emerald Nightmare, I think we were third or fourth. We were pretty solid. Towards the end, when it was sort of simplified a lot by more stats and set bonuses and legendaries and trinkets and stuff, I think we were pretty high up then as well. That was the same point that Windwalker was really high up there, so we might have been a bit overshadowed. But I think for most of the Legion, we sat in a reasonably good numerical point.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's more than just the numerics, but as far as that goes, we're
Yeah.
solid.
Yeah, recall
Yeah, Nighthold was good for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I remember like Nighthold or like early Tomb, something like that. Like around then, I remember seeing a bump in Feral play, etc. So Legion had some, I would say, overall, averaged out to mediocre times for Feral, right? Some ups, some downs. Moving along to BFA, not something too many people want to talk about. What changed for Feral? Anything big? Because certainly this expansion, I feel like, at least from a more external perspective, or at least raid leading perspective or community perspective, Feral didn't really seem to have a time when there was a major patch that it was like, oh my god, Feral's like the Prot Warrior treatment and they're gods and Feral's everywhere kind of thing.
No. I don't think there has been a point in this expansion where we've been incredible. At the start of Uldir, we were objectively pretty bad.
We were struggling to beat, I think, healers at the beginning of Uldir. Like it was an uphill battle, I think, at that.
We got some hotfix and it ended up okay, but then in 8.1 they obviously they revamped us. They sort of changed how mastery worked for us. They added some new talents. They shifted some stuff around, and we've basically been in that state since 8.1.
We gained some things and we lost some things. So like we lost that haste benefit, didn't we? Because we used to have, when you shift into cat form, was it 50%? It started out at 50%, and it got nerfed in pre-patch, going into BFA down to 25%.
Yeah,
so basically when you shifted into cat form, you gained like 50% haste on top of your regular value. So
they added that in Legion Beta as like, because haste wasn't very good for us originally, because haste didn't increase the tick rate of bleeds, where it increased the tick rate of other dots. So haste was the opposite of stonks. So they added this band-aid where we just got 50% more haste from gear for no reason, and that made haste a little bit better. And then in BFA, they made it so bleeds did increase their tick rate with haste. But they forgot that they'd given us this 50% haste multiplier in Legion. So haste went woo through the roof, and we very much liked haste until they remembered that it existed and they removed it.
And from a Mythic Plus standpoint in BFA, we started out very poorly. Like I say, we were struggling to beat healers. We were getting clowned on in Mythic Plus, and I think it was 8.1 or like 8.15 that we got Primal Wrath, which is our AoE finisher that AoE finisher that applies rip to every mob, and is in Shadowlands still uncapped. So it's like our that was the thing that was going to kind of return us to any sense of glory in a Mythic Plus environment. But unfortunately, the damage had already been done kind of perception-wise that we weren't able to bring it back at that point. I do feel like in BFA, I know you said we haven't had a glory moment, but I really think that last patch, Feral was actually at its best point in BFA from a Mythic Plus standpoint, because pre-corruption, I actually didn't fear any DPS. Like there was no DPS that came into the fray that I actually thought, oh god, I'm like these guys are going to clown on me. I actually felt comfortable going up against rogues, comfortable going up against demon hunters, comfortable going up against like pretty much anything, and knowing that I was likely to be top DPS. And so, but I think that was like nobody really saw it because nobody knew it was there, I guess.
Well, when you say last patch, you mean 8.2, right? Like pre
8.2. 8.2,
okay.
sorry. Yeah.
Because if you were going to say 8.3, I was like, well, everybody was
no.
in their peak with corruption doing 70% of their damage.
Corruption was actually worse for us in relation to the other specs in the game because I feel like we didn't scale as well. Obviously, say like BM Hunter or like Fire Mage and stuff in terms of corruption. So all these other specs that were allowed to kind of fill the kind of plug the holes with corruption, it actually was worse for us. I feel from a personal standpoint. I don't know if other ferals have this kind of feeling that we were stronger in 8.2 comparable to the other specs in the game.
It's obviously because our main stat, the stat that we like the most, and the stat we get from Azerite is crit, which obviously has a natural cap of 100%, unlike mastery or haste or whatever that goes up to as large a number as you can imagine. So
why is it that like I would think, at least just hearing it generally, right? I would think that bleed scaling with haste, because I know it was big for Guardian, right, with Blood Frenzy, and getting the rage gen from that is a pretty big deal in M+. I'd have thought for Feral it would be a huge deal. So why is it that haste kind of fell down the totem pole behind crit again? Like, are bleeds just that small of a portion of your damage?
Bleeds just aren't a huge portion of your damage.
It's shred and ferocious
other stats also scale them. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's basically it. It's just bleeds what I think 20% of your damage portion on live at the moment, which is okay, but it's obviously not a huge margin. And outside of bleed damage, we get a bit more energy, but we already have enough energy really, and crit gives us more resources more effectively. So haste kind of just falls off a little bit.
Our Azerite is set up for improving the damage of our shred and our swipe, and not any like finisher element or any of our bleeds. And then so our two best Azerite, one is just increases your crit basically, and the other one is increase the damage of your shred and your swipe. So even our Azerite didn't complement us there. So yeah, like Guilty's saying, with just our ease of access to crit, then we were able to kind of just basically just go a spam build. So like, you know how we were discussing the aspect of bleeds being very strong in Legion, in BFA suddenly we just became this spam bot, and we basically became like a halfway house between an outlaw rogue and an assassin rogue, but neither actually excels in any real way. So it's kind of like we're an outlaw rogue and assassination rogue, but with half the talent options, you know?
Do you guys want to see a return to like a heavier emphasis on bleeds in terms of damage output? I mean, thematically, that's how Feral's always been known, right?
That's a contested one. I think depending on which Feral you ask, like I made a joke one time about if you asked all 5 Ferals what style of play style they want Feral to be. Yeah. if you ask all 5 Ferals what play style of Feral they want it to be, they would all give you a different answer. And I think that is like very paramount. And I personally, like, I came into Feral in Legion, so I saw that bleed style, I saw that maintenance of many things and the spinning plates, and I went, whoa, this is really cool. So for me, that's what I want to kind of return to, is the emphasis on bleeds. But I also, like, as somebody who's doing, like, you know, 26, 27 keys and whatnot, that ease of access to jump into a more spam build is also very, very nice to have. Because when you're in that high level of key, you want to be focusing more so on mechanics and less so on perfecting the perfect little rotation. So if you could do something that does slightly less damage, but you can focus on your interrupts, your stuns, your soothes, your whatever, then just overall you're in a better spot.
Yeah, personally, I much preferred that we were... I really enjoyed the spinning plates spec. I enjoyed the micromanagement, and I enjoyed all of that. I think it performed okay, even in Mythic Plus. I think it probably could have been better. And if it had Primal Wrath, I think it probably would have blasted.
Do you not worry that... I mean, just to touch on that, like to kind of expand on the thought that you're both saying right now, do you not think that if bleed emphasis was too high, you'd kind of end up with the I mean, at least baseline Shadow Priest Affliction Law kind of issue. You're still ramping up, getting all your bleeds up. The pack's dead already because all the warriors have come in and bursted them down, etc. All the blade flares have gone off.
Not really, because you
Not
can.
with Primal Wrath,
at
least.
Yeah, with Primal Wrath, you can pre-prep. So as you finish combat, you go into the next set of combat with your Blood Talons talent already procced with 5 combo points and Tiger's Fury reset. So you basically initiate into combat with a Rake. Immediately everything's then bleeding from Primal Wrath, and then you just follow it up with a Thrash, and you're there. You're already like rocking. The only thing is at the beginning of an expansion where, say, a Demon Hunter can come in. Oh, there's a Demon Hunter comparison. Where a Demon Hunter can come in and quick eye beam and everything's dead. We do need that moment for our Primal Wrath to be ticking. So as keys start to get up from like the +2s to the +4s, like we're just kind of dog shit. But as we start to get into like the +15s, +18s, +20s, suddenly mobs are alive long enough that we actually can start to rock.
Oh, that didn't take long to mention Havoc.
Yeah,
I thought that was going to be later, but
take off your bingo cards, team. We got it.
I also don't necessarily think it's like a core issue with dot specs that you might have to ramp up a little bit. It's kind of, I feel like Afflictions performed decently in M+ in the past, despite being a dot spec, and I think Shadow's just the only one waiting for its time to shine, really.
Well, I mean, it looks like it might be with these changes, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, the thing with dot classes is often the longer they live, if you get everything up, then you're good to go. I mean, damage wise, they can even outperform. I mean, historically over the expansions that we've seen, it's just when packs get burst down quickly, then you're just not, you're still spending GCDs getting everything up, and well, it doesn't work out so well. So really, if we think about it, not really any major substantial changes between Legion, BFA, leading down the road in the past 4 years.
Yeah, it's primarily just the AoE changes that they added that are the sort of the major ones that actually matter in terms of how it plays.
So then moving along into Shadowlands, where we stand now, definitely off the top of my head at least, we've had, I know we talked about this a bit earlier, kind of pre-stream, we've had already like 3 iterations of Blood Talons. Sabretooth has changed a bit. You guys, I mean, that was really it, if I remember correctly. You'll know better than me. What else was changed for Shadowlands?
Yes. There was some minor changes to Moonfire. They made Moonfire last a bit longer. There was obviously the affinity changes. So now each affinity gives an active ability as opposed to the passives that it currently gives. There was a small buff to Savage Roar. There was some retuning to Incarnation. Heart of the Wild was added in the utility row, which is a bit of a mess.
A mess, you think?
And yes, a mess. Yes.
Okay.
We can talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, well,
I actually don't mind that. So that's interesting. I actually don't mind that, but we can cover that a bit later.
Oh god.
It's just where it is in the talent tree that bothers me.
Yeah, potentially.
But yeah, so there weren't a huge amount of changes. The Sabretooth change is really nice. I'm a huge fan of the Sabretooth change because it's taken what is one of my most disliked talents. And while I'm still not a huge fan of it, it's at least an actually interesting talent now. There's like some gameplay and thought around it, which is really good.
Yeah, I would jump on that and say the thing with Sabretooth is obviously before it would just, you'd apply an initial rip and then you would never rip again for the remainder of combat. You would just Ferocious Bite. So it removed, like your problem with the Guilty was that it removed an aspect of your base rotation where you weren't continuing to rip, and so it just removed rip from the scene. So then say you switch to Lunar Inspiration or Predator, and then suddenly wait, I've got to rip now instead of ferocious biting, and it kind of is a little bit disjointed in that sense. But now what they've done is they've made that change, and they are now saying, hey, Sabretooth is going to help you maintain that initial rip longer, but you're still going to need to rip at some point in the fight. More than just that initial rip. But if they then change the damage of, say, the Sabretooth benefit that it applies to your Ferocious Bite, or changes rip damage or something, I think that's a fair change. But right now, we've actually lost Ferocious Bites. The total amount of Ferocious Bites in a fight, we've now lost some of that. And if they can tune the damage to reflect that loss of Ferocious Bites over the course of a 3-minute, 5-minute, 8-minute fight, then I think that is a decent change, but ultimately I would like to see that as it was before, as an execute.
Execute would be fine. I've talked about execute before and other stuff. Is that it was a point you reached in the fight where it was a change.
Yeah, and it was like, okay, now it's go time. Like, you did your management, you did that, and then you got rewarded by getting this, like, burst period, right? Now we're going to blast.
Yeah, so Sabertooth basically, the change now is it kind of just makes, to use a Shadow Priest comparison, it makes Rip into sort of old Void form. You're constantly trying to push that Rip and maintain it, and eventually it's going to fall off. So you need to make the decision then of, am I going to snapshot this with the Tiger's Fury, or am I just going to push it a little bit more and maybe get one more Ferocious Bite and have a non-Tiger's Fury Rip?
It used to extend by how much before? Because it was just a set it and forget it, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think it was 5 seconds or something per combo point, but it was enough that you never dropped Rip. Basically.
Like you snapshotted it once, and that was it, pretty much.
Yeah. Basically, the opener was you pressed Rip, you pressed Tiger's Fury in stealth, and you pressed Rip, and then you pressed Rake, and then Rip, and then you never pressed Rip again for the rest of the fight.
Okay.
Yeah.
So since we've gotten, I guess we've had a good kind of historical or relatively historical lead up. Obviously, I would say if we're gonna go way back, right? Like Feral had a lot of its golden days in MOP, if I'm not mistaken, gentlemen.
I missed those. I didn't get to experience those. Feels bad.
It was very fun.
So Feral's in some ways come a long way since then. In some ways, not so much, but in at least relative timing since Legion and the kind of rehaul, etc. And these past 2 expansions are now leading into Shadowlands. As we've kind of now confirmed, there haven't been really any substantial changes, right? We haven't had any revamps to the spec, nothing absolutely crazy, no new resource system, nothing of the sort. So baseline, they're still pretty similar to what they used to be. So we now start having to dive into the kind of nitty gritty of it that has led Feral down the road to where it is, and why the community perceives it the way they do, why Blizzard hasn't made many changes to it. I don't want to say finger pointing here, but we do have to start to kind of get at these core issues and see, well, why is Feral where it is right now? So that being said, I've talked a lot. I played it myself, obviously not to the level you guys do. And, I've read in the community. I've talked to you guys before the show a bit. And a lot of the perception of the community is that Feral's garbage, Feral's a meme spec, lol, I'll never bring a Feral to my groups. But it seems that the people who actually have a decent amount of knowledge for Feral say that it's not really, like, the spec itself, core, is fine, right? It's lacking in other directions.
Obviously, I'll mostly talk about Raid here because Sai is the big M plusy boy. Feral numerically, even now, is fine. It doesn't have a primary reason to bring them, really. It's kind of just a melee spec in an expansion and an environment where melee specs aren't hugely popular. Or, well, they are hugely popular, but they're not hugely popular with the raid leaders, which is what's relevant here.
Well,
it doesn't bring darkness. It doesn't bring a unique buff. It doesn't bring rallying cry. Stampeding Roar is nice sometimes, and when it's really nice, it's really, really nice. See Kill Jaden.
Yeah.
We really like Stampeding Roar there. But it kind of just doesn't have anything unique that it brings, and it kind of lacks from that. Is basically it. Now, there are problems, obviously, in that if you do give something unique to Feral, and something that's meaningful and unique to Feral, then Feral's low representation even when it's strong. Even in Mists of Pandaria, when Feral was really, really good and was smashing the meters, and there was 2 in Method's World First Comp at one point, if I remember correctly. Even back then, Feral was still fairly low representation.
Well, let's not forget BWD. With I don't know how many, like 20 druids or something.
Paragon, they had a few
right.
Feral druids then. But again, even then, Feral as a whole was fairly low representation. You can look back at the numbers, and Feral sort of sticks around 3-4%, the high end of the population.
Okay.
So if you give something unique to Feral, and something that is meaningful and unique, and something that you want in the raid, then that causes a problem. Because you don't want every raid group to have to find a Feral Druid. Because there aren't enough Feral Druids.
True, but there could be, right? And the problem is we live in a modern WoW now where there are a lot of those unique buffs and debuffs. I mean, you guys mentioned it yourself, Havoc. monks, right? So
Yeah.
so you're right. Like, do we want to move in a direction where each individual spec and or class brings something unique, so you're forced to try to somehow slot 36 specs for 20 spots? I don't think anybody really wants that. Or
I don't think anybody wants that.
Yeah, see, this is what I jump on, and like I've had this conversation so much about the fact that Feral doesn't have leader of the pack, which I think is what we're all sitting here thinking of, right? That nice little additional crit buff. And a lot of the time people give me the reason of, well, we should get it because Enhance has Wind Fury Totem, and DKs have anti-magic zone, and Monk has that, and like you look at it and there's like 8 or so raid buffs or whatever, and you think there are like 5 on a good day melee raid spots, maybe 6, right? And if you think like, if anything, that actually makes it worse that we should get leader of the pack, because what's going to happen is, you as a big boy raider, you'll probably know, like when you're forming your raid comp, you're gonna work out, okay, well, we have say 8 raid buffs to figure out here, and we've got 5 spots for melee. Well, we're gonna work out mathematically what are the best 5, and the things that aren't the best, aren't as good as those top 5, are just not going to be taken. So it's all well and good having that raid buff, but it's either to the point where it's so powerful that you're guaranteed a raid spot, and should Feral be guaranteed a raid spot when there are 36 specs in the game, 24 DPS or whatever, should Feral be guaranteed a raid spot? Or the alternative is that leader of the pack is not going to be strong enough to compete with the other raid buffs, in which case it will not do anything. It's not going to guarantee that raid spot anyway, or kind of help us with that raid spot. So it's nice to have, but I don't think, if Blizzard gave us leader of the pack tomorrow, I don't think that would suddenly guarantee us that raid spot that I think everyone's hoping for.
Do you think that maybe they move in a direction then where they extend some of these unique buffs to say 1-2 more classes? Like what if Feral also carried the physical debuff? I think that is the solution,
honestly.
Feral 5% physical debuff, right?
Yeah, I honestly think that is, and that obviously that's what they had in Warlords of Draenor, when there was 10 buffs as a total, and those were split out across the various classes and specs. I think that is a far better solution than anything unique.
But if you jump on what the Windwalker guys were saying, J-Funk and Babylonius, they were saying, well, you don't bring a monk, you don't bring a Windwalker, you bring a Brewmaster, or worst case, a Mistweaver. So would that not have the same issue?
I mean, it would...
Based on what? It just gives you more space to sort of build your comp. Maybe you have a Demon Hunter and you could take him, or maybe your Feral Druid.
Yeah, you have that option.
Take him.
You have the option at least. Yeah, the flexibility. I mean, you're right. It's but then at least it goes down more to, let's say there was a world, some kind of magical Narnia style world, where Windwalker and Feral were just competing for a spot. 2 of the top DPS for melee. We only have 1 more melee spot, guys. What do we bring? I mean, in a world where one brings 5% physical damage to the raid and one doesn't, right? That's an automatic kind of bump against it. Yeah. But if you both had it, then it would be more of a consideration on which is not only which performs better on paper, but then it starts getting down to, well, which one of these players do we think is the better performer as well,
Yeah. I do think every spec either needs to bring a raid buff, or they need either everyone gets it or nobody gets it. Because this halfway house where some do and some don't, it is a weakness. But I also am skeptical to think that suddenly leader of the pack would guarantee us that position. But I wouldn't complain if Blizzard implemented it. I'd be like, okay, that's cool. But I would
you'd be stupid not to, right? You play Feral.
No, I want us to be bad. No, I'm skeptical that it's going to be the golden ticket, if you will. But like you say, if you have that choice, then you go, oh well, we know Billy the Feral is really good. Oh, and now he brings leader of the pack, so we have a justification to bring him. We don't want to have him re-roll or whatever, or bring somebody else who may not be as dedicated and whatnot. So it's a good point.
We're building.
I think at current tuning, if you gave Feral leader of the pack, you could take Feral, because leader of the pack would be fucking ludicrously broken.
Yeah, it'd be like three or three. It's been, I think it's had iterations of 3 and 5%, right? At some point in its history.
Yeah.
It's 5% crit at the moment. That would be insane.
Yeah.
But I just don't think that it is, and this is negative against Feral. I don't think it is good community-wise to force every raid group to have a Feral. So I do think that sort of spreading the raid buffs out, so you have a choice of, we have this Feral or we have this Monk. They both bring the same thing, which is the better player.
And what we have to jump on to with that is in a Mythic Plus scenario, suddenly now Feral's bringing 5% crit to the whole group. If you then say, well, Feral's like looking very strong for Mythic Plus now, and then let's imagine that Resto Druid is still the go-to healer in Mythic Plus in Shadowlands. Well, suddenly 2 of the 5 spots in Mythic Plus are dedicated to Druid specs. And in a world where Druid has very strong representation, I again don't think that is a fair position to be in. But I have other kind of discussions to have on what utility I think we should get instead.
The thing is, well, first of all, I appreciate that you're modestly arguing for a world where there should be equal representation of everybody all the time. So I respect that. But the reality is we live in a pretty cutthroat WoW design right now where what you're saying, like just like nice guys finish last kind of thing right now. And the problem is you're like, well, I don't think there should be an overwhelming reason to bring Feral, and like everybody should have their chance to come in. But the reality is you guys don't, while other people do, right? There's a reason you see nothing but hunters and rogues and DKs and like DHs and all that kind of stuff, right?
But so then I think that's a community perception issue, less so a lack of utility.
Right. So I'm glad you guys flexed in that direction a bit. So I'm going to like just reshuffle. We'll get to the kind of community perception and reason why Feral's there. But since we're moving in this kind of lack of utility direction from not just a me, but like everyone, right? Like everyone is kind of, privy to this situation. Feral baseline seems okay, right? You guys haven't come out like the Windwalker guys did a few days ago, saying that there's so many bugs and so many issues rotationally and this and that and big complaints with the baseline of the class. For the most part, you're both pretty happy with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Baseline, I think we're really good. Like we have, the way I put it is a lot of people saying, oh, should we get a rework and whatnot? But I think if Feral was #1 in DPS, I don't think anyone would ask for pretty much anything when it comes to like Feral as if excluding utility. I think if you look at like our DPS rotation and whatnot, we have everything that I think we really need. We have an AoE bleed finisher. We have a single target non-bleed finisher. We have a single target bleed combo point generator. We have a single target non-bleed combo point generator. We have an AoE non-combo generator that isn't a bleed, and we have one that is a bleed. Like we have everything within that. So from a non-utility standpoint, I think Feral actually, as a base in terms of comfortability, like the spec works, it feels good, it feels enjoyable, it feels powerful, in my opinion.
What do you think, Guilty?
I think the spec plays pretty well at the moment. I've been enjoying it thoroughly on beta. I think it's improvement to how it plays on live. Live is kind of flooded with energy, and energy as a resource only really works as sort of something that you care about when you don't have functionally infinite energy, because then it's just mana. So I think it's in a good place. I've enjoyed it on beta. I think the changes they've made to the talents have been broadly positive. I kind of have mixed feelings about Blood Talons, but I like it enough that those mixed feelings don't drive me away. So I'm pretty happy with how Feral plays as a core DPS specialization right now.
Okay. What about, because I know for Guardian, I kind of bitch about it all the time, but Berserk is so bad for Guardian. I don't know if it's any different for Feral.
Open it up. Let's go.
I'll talk about this. All right,
Berserk
is an awful cooldown. It's so bad. And I'd almost forgotten that it was a cooldown we had, because it's just so bad.
It is just trash. The funny thing is, okay, the way to sum up Berserk is that when you Bloodlust, your cooldown is actually now useless. Like, what cooldown on a 3-minute timer becomes useless with Bloodlust? You know what I mean? Like, okay, it's not like useless, but it's like you gain like such slight improvement from actually popping Berserk, to the point where some people say, hey, should I hold Berserk until after Bloodlust? That sums up Berserk.
Anyone's wondering.
Yeah, the answer is probably yes, yeah.
But yeah, Berserk is an awful cooldown. It's 3 minutes, which from a raiding point of view, 3-minute cooldowns don't usually line up with mechanics. So we can go back and we can look at like Kingaroth, and we can look at Avatar, and we can look at various other fights where there's damage amp phase or where there's phases where you have to burst into something, and they so often line up with 3 minutes. So it's a 3-minute cooldown, which is already like a check mark down in my books. But then to make it worse, it's a weak 3-minute cooldown. Like, it's really weak. It's 40% energy reduction, and that's it. And what makes it even worse is they nerfed it during BFA. Like, Berserk at the start of the expansion was awful. Berserk at the start of the expansion was 0.3% DPS gain. It was... That's probably an exaggeration. I think it was close to 1%. But it was tiny. It was minuscule. And they nerfed it. They made it even worse than the cooldown that was barely worth pressing.
Yeah.
It's just not a good button. And to be fair, it's actually somehow gotten better a little bit with the introduction of Mastery, because suddenly you have Ferocious Bite becomes more damage, and you've got easier ways of transferring energy into damage, which was a historical problem with Berserk. But Tiger's Fury, which is a 30-second cooldown, is, I'm pretty sure, stronger at the moment than Berserk on the 3-minute cooldown. And that's not accounting for the fact that one's a 30-second cooldown and one's a 3-minute cooldown. I think just raw power for power, Tiger's Fury is just better.
And my problem,
and it's off GCD, isn't it, Tiger's Fury? Yeah, it is.
Yes, and Berserk is on GCD.
Yeah. And my problem, though, talking about Berserk and then mentioning Tiger's Fury, is that I'm scared that Blizzard are going to say, okay, we'll make it so that when you press Berserk, you gain 15% increased damage for the duration. And then to compensate, we'll remove it from Tiger's Fury. Like, I'm scared that they're going to do that. So I don't like to talk about Berserk and then mention Tiger's Fury. Like, leave Tiger's Fury where it is, but Berserk needs some attention. Yeah.
What? So what,
really awful.
What do you guys want to, like, what would be some suggestions in your head to make Berserk better? Outside of probably making it a 2-minute, I would assume.
I didn't mean that. Yeah, that. I've always wished that it was somewhat like Shadowlands, because obviously Feral gains stealth bonuses during on Shred and Rake. So I've always wished that it was a 1-minute cooldown that gave us stealth for a brief period. That would be interesting. I like cooldowns which make me think about what buttons I'm pressing and what they do differently, rather than just you do something faster or you do something harder. There was a really interesting set bonus we have that got made into a legendary, completely ruined it by making it into a legendary, whereby any yellow damage, so any special damage, so Shred, Ferocious Bite, all of that, you dealt during Berserk got turned into a bleed during Berserk. So that was kind of cool. When they made it into a legendary, they made it so it was only combo point generating abilities. So it's awful, because our combo point generating abilities don't do a whole lot of damage. We're very finisher focused nowadays. Those would be the two that I would like them to look at. So sort of.
What do you think, Sai?
Converting damage into bleed,
I mean,
I
think both options sound very good. I think like you're saying with the legendary, where the amount of damage you do is then converted into a bleed for a duration of time. I think that plays into our bleed style, and I think that could be effective. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't have like any fantastic, like you're saying, Guilty. I mean, I think it's good when a cooldown actually feels like you change something about either your playstyle or you put some kind of thought put into it.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like just giving it a flat damage increase during the duration of Berserk wouldn't be good. Like, so for example, Incon, when you use Incon, like then your moves, your abilities are acting as if you are from stealth, and like you're saying with Shred and Rake, they have a damage increase when used from stealth. I think that's, I don't know, I wouldn't like maybe make Incon like, I don't want to say baseline, but I kind of want to say baseline. But yeah, I think what Guilty kind of hinted at are two solid options. I think the legendary should just be baseline and remove it as a legendary option, because like you're saying, I don't think anyone's really gonna take it at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Like, really, I just don't want it to be a 3-minute cooldown.
Yeah, I don't
yeah, or
3-minute
cooldown, they normally line up as well very poorly with trinkets. So, for example, I feel like Plumage in King's Rest would have been a very big trinket, but it's on a 2-minute cooldown,
mm-hmm.
so it never fully lines up, really. So maybe play with the timer of it. If Berserk was like a 1-minute 30 or something, then it would be good. But like I say, I mean, even in Mythic Plus, like if say you pull like 20 mobs, you start blasting AoE in, you actually don't bother using Berserk because you don't need energy when you're primal wrathing. So you actually don't use Berserk. You save it for like 1 to 3 targets, and then anything above 3 targets, you just don't bother berserking in BFA.
Well, honestly, frankly, why don't they just remove Berserk? Give us Feral Frenzy baseline or something?
Could do.
It's,
would be good.
but I don't feel like Berserk is particularly iconic to Feral.
Yeah,
Feral friendly, Ashman's
Feral
friendly.
Frenzy. I'd take Feral Frenzy.
I'd be
based
happy
on,
to
like,
get rid of it too from a bear perspective.
Yeah,
It's so
yeah,
bad.
definitely.
Yeah, but you'd much rather have Rage of the Sleeper back, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a Lego for that, but that's a whole other can of worms right now.
Yeah.
Apparently, we started a cat harem here on beta on my screen right now.
I've
but,
noticed,
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so like we'll touch on the legendaries and some more details on the talents a bit later, but where I wanted to go with the utility perspective and the kind of chat we got in from lacking of unique utility is that you guys are not just lacking unique utility, but you got kind of even further overshadowed and whammied by boomkins now, right? The other your druid sister or brother or stepbrother class that has now also has stampeding roar, right? Is ranged in a world where oftentimes we bring usually more range than melee to encounters unless there's an encounter that's particularly bad for ranged, and they bring innervate on top of it. So we start to live in a world of, well, yeah, why bring Feral when we can bring a boomkin right now? You guys don't do 50% more damage than a boomkin or anything of the sort, and they bring all the same goodies you do plus more. So this whole utility thing really starts to seem to hammer really badly on Feral.
Yeah, I would say.
Go
Go
ahead.
I was just going to say this is a very contentious point for me. So I feel like throughout BFA, initially I feel like Boomkin was a competitor for us, like just naturally. But I think as we progressed, it became Resto. Like if there was a Resto Druid and an Outlaw Rogue in your group, which likely there was, then there was absolutely zero requirement for Feral. Like they just brought nothing to the group because the full extent of the utility was already kind of established with those two. But now going into Shadowlands, I feel like Boomkin is our biggest competitor, and I think the lack of Trent and Innovate are the two most significant issues. If you actually looked at the utility gain going from BFA into Shadowlands, it was something like Boomkin gained the most, Resto stayed the same, Feral Druid lost, Boomkin stayed the same. Boomkin gained like 3 things, Resto gained like 1 thing, Feral stayed the same, and then Guardian actually lost stuff. And the access for Boomkin to now have Trent, have Innovate, they've gained Vortex, and they have baseline Typhoon, whereas Feral, we have to choose between, well, we have Maim, but we have to choose between Vortex or Typhoon now. Well, Boomkin now brings more that they get Typhoon and Vortex together. The only thing I can say is that by Feral Affinity bringing Maim, it actually technically nerfs Resto Druid, because Resto Druid now has to decide, well, do I want increased damage by going Feral Affinity, but I lose Typhoon, or do I want to go Boomkin Affinity, probably not do as much damage, but I retain Typhoon? So there is it's at least benefited us comparable to Resto a little bit, but yeah, Boomkin is kind of out of control right now, comparable to the other Druid specs, and I think that they should make Trent and Innovate baseline, so that instead of it being a case of we want a Boomkin DPS, it becomes a case of we want a Druid DPS, and I think that would be the big thing that narrows the gap.
Okay, Guilty, what do you think?
Yeah, so this is where I get to talk about why I'm not a fan of Heart of the Wild and where it is in the talent tree.
Okay.
So obviously the change they made with affinities was the balanced affinity Typhoon, and they took it out of that utility row, and they put it on the Heart of the Wild on the utility row. So I don't think this makes a whole lot of sense. Firstly, Heart of the Wild is completely dependent upon what affinity you have. So it's a talent that's dependent in how it works on what other talent you have, which seems a bit ridiculous to me. But also, I feel like this was the perfect opportunity to make Heart of the Wild baseline, because it's dependent on a talent already, so why make the talent as well? You're making 2 choices instead of 1 in order to get something.
Mm-hmm.
And then to give balance affinity Innovate as its utility component, and to leave Typhoon on the utility row where it begins, where it exists already. So I think this would obviously give us Innovate, which I think makes a lot more sense than putting Typhoon there. And B, from a sort of other perspective, like I know I'm talking about Feral here, but sort of from a Resto Druid and from a Guardian perspective here, Heart of the Wild is a DPS cooldown, right? So it's essentially competing with DPS on a utility row, which I think is nonsensical, and it removes any choice from that row, really. So it just feels to me like it makes far more sense to have Heart of the Wild baseline and Typhoon where it exists at the moment, and that gives you space to innovate to other classes.
Yeah.
And maybe they're worried about resto, but
yeah. The only location that I've found Heart of the Wild being useful so far, I mean, obviously, I think you could in a raid environment say, we're going to drop one healer off, we're going to have a Feral that goes Resto Affinity, and during some big panic moment, they're going to go hot. So say like Malt, for example, that's a really good fight where you don't really want an additional healer because there's still a big DPS check, but you have a moment in the fight that is very hectic and very high prio on healing. So you could have a Feral that can switch into, resto and then heal a bunch and then jump back in. And it kind of acts as like an additional healer cooldown if it was able to be that potent. But the only use I can think of besides that for Heart of the Wild is right now, if you take Night Fae and you take Convoke the Spirits, you can actually pre-dot everything in Feral with Primal Wrath and Thrash uncapped. So you get everything with the Feral Bleeds. And then you Heart of the Wild, it puts you in Boomkin, increases damage of all your Boomkin abilities by 30%, and then you Convoke, and you basically Starfall, Sunfire, Full Moon, and you get... I beat Boomkins playing Starfall, like...
so ridiculously it is the thing, but it is the thing.
It won't scale, though. It won't scale, so eventually, like, conduits of, like, Ferocious Bite damage being increased will eventually outscale because you'll get such big gain on Ferocious Bite that it won't be worth jumping into, say, Boomkin form and doing that. But that's the only use I've found of it so far. But then again,
really, it's just an AoE thing.
Exactly, and it's a case of why is that then on a utility row? Because now, and someone actually brought this up to me, and I'm not actually 100% sure if it's true, but they said Druid is the only class in the game with 3 utility trees. And is that...
It might be, but I don't necessarily think that's a problem. Personally, if I was doing talents, I'd have all of them be utility trees. But...
I don't necessarily. Yeah, true. Actually, I don't necessarily think it's a massive issue, but it's like we are having this 3 trees of utility, but then some of them are a little bit kind of like skewed. Is
like half utility, half DPS.
Yeah, you want it to at least like be crystal clear. Like, okay, here's like 3 good options. Like rather than we've got 3 trees and some of them are kind of a little bit muddled. Where
Yes. Yeah, having a DPS choice on a utility row is, I think, firmly bad. And I think Heart of the Wild has potential to do that. Even without Convoke, potentially there could be a fight where you have to stand away from the boss, and then Heart of the Wild becomes a DPS choice again. Like even on N'Zoth now, if you get a far pull thingy, then you might want to pop Heart of the Wild and press some Boomkin buttons. But yeah, I just don't think it makes sense for it to be in the talent tree where it is. I think it makes far more sense for it to be baseline, which then gives them more space for balance affinity to be shared out. Because, yes, balance does have more utility than Feral does, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Especially now they have Stampeding Roar. It's just, it is what it is.
Yeah.
It probably shouldn't be that way.
It's one thing to talk about, utility versus Havoc and Rogue and that kind of thing, but kind of in your own backyard, to be usurped by your ranged brother Spec is not exactly what you want, unfortunately. So hopefully they do attend that, because it's legit, like that small fact on top of what's already happened seemingly in the past 4 years of just lacking that unique or major utility. Because from an M+ perspective, your utility is pretty good, right? Generally, it's not dissimilar to Guardian, and Guardian has some nice things. It's nice to get some Ursals or a Typhoon and Master Root. And there's even been some fights that we've seen in M+, I'm sure you've seen as well, Psy, where Master Root's actually really good, like with the first boss in Plaguefall.
Junkyard is insane.
I was talking about Shadowlands stuff. Yeah, so even going into Shadowlands, it's, like they have some solid M+ utility. Unfortunately, Guilty, as you know, or as you both know, really, that oftentimes that kind of utility, just like Vengeance Demon Hunter utility, it doesn't really translate into raid very well, right? Like there's not too many opportunities where you Typhoon and Ursals. Yeah, sure, once in a while you have like an ad fight where it's good, but it's few and far between. So utility being kind of the major downfall of Feral, or one of the major downfalls of Feral, as you guys have been saying, we're still kind of trapped with this community perception that they're really just not very good. And one thing that I want to, even though they are, right, like we've talked about baseline, they can pump, they can do the damage, they have some solid utility here and there. One thing I want to touch on too is the kind of player skill floor entry to being able to play Feral effectively. And one of the things that I personally picked up on playing it was, frankly, it felt really bad to have to do like triple the amount of work of a lot of other melee and still just barely do their amount of damage, right? Whereas a Demon Hunter comes in and just I-beam right away and, you know, we're good. So that felt really bad. So what are your guys' perspectives? Where do you stand on something like something that requires a higher skill input should be rewarded with higher DPS?
I mean, I play Feral, so if they want to give me more DPS, then I'm entirely okay with that. Personally, as much as I raid competitively and all of that, I do play the game to enjoy myself. So I'm entirely okay if my spec is just okay, but I enjoy it more.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that personally. I know some people aren't, and some people wish that Feral was rewarded more for its complexity. And I wouldn't hate that. I wouldn't oppose that in any way. I'd quite like that. But at the end of the day, as long as I'm enjoying the spec and I feel like I'm competing, then I'm okay.
The thing is right now I'd say Feral, and even in Shadowlands, well, with the exception of like with the addition of Covenants and like Legendaries and stuff changing things slightly, baseline, I think Feral is in the easiest state it's been in for a while, but potentially the thing is that it's looking like we're going to be going back to that spinning plate style with the addition of like legendaries. So I feel like Feral is now actually going to get harder, and I already know that a lot of people do struggle with. I know, for example, like Blood Talons, a lot of people do struggle with playing that, and I know a lot of people come to me and say, "Hey, I'm not very good with it. I don't like it. Can I play MOC instead?" And I get that question quite a lot actually, and it's one of those where when you play something, I don't know, this sounds like, it's like one of those things where when you play something, it doesn't feel that complex. Like if I go and actually play, like I actually find Windwalker is really difficult. So I go and play Windwalker and I'm like, damn, this is actually difficult. So I think it's just when you're not as well versed at something, there is going to be that. I think every spec in the game has the ability to feel difficult if you're not well versed with it. So I don't actually inherently think Feral is super complex.
But on live, it certainly isn't.
I don't think it's actually like, AoE is literally you go into combat, you rake, you Primal Wrath, you thrash, and then you just swipe. Like once you've got thrash up on everything, you just swipe and Primal Wrath. Like that's your rotation.
In my brain, I don't have unfortunately a comparison like to Feral and Live because I haven't really played Feral and Live.
Yeah,
but having played like all of the melee, just at least like baseline, just trying them out in dungeons and stuff. Yeah. There's a noticeable difference when you play something like Windwalker or Feral versus something like Outlaw or Havoc. And I almost I'll be a bit brazen here and I'll say almost objectively. I know definitely some people have different strengths and weaknesses, like you're saying, Sai. Hey, like I find Windwalker a bit tough, and somebody might find it a bit easier if they're well versed with it. But I want to say, like almost objectively, there's no way you can't find something like Feral harder than something like Outlaw or Havoc in terms of not just necessarily rotation and button priority, but with the amount of buffs and debuffs that you have to manage as well on top of it.
I'm curious if you tried Assassination.
Yes.
How did you feel about Assassination versus Feral?
I mean, certainly more towards the Feral end of things than the Havoc end of things with Assass as well, in terms of dot management and bleed management and stuff. Which I'm a fan of, by the way. Like, I love things like Affliction and Shadow, and Feral was, I like that kind of stuff with some kind of dot management and stuff. I just find that personally compelling gameplay, but not everyone does.
I definitely think that more difficult gameplay should, like, at the end of the day, you should be rewarded for being better, right? Like, if you are able to maximize the efficiency of something, you should have that reward in a higher DPS number and a higher number on the meter, right? So I agree. I think because we're looking at it a case of Feral was more complex. It's gotten easier, but I guess it is still difficult. To answer your question, I think if something is more difficult, then you should be rewarded with that, with being able to execute that. Because otherwise, what is the point? You may as well go and play a Demon Hunter or an Outlaw Rogue or something like that. But then I think that comes into in a Mythic Plus environment, Outlaw is easier to play mechanically in terms of DPS, but when you incorporate all the additional things it has to do with like sat blinds of things and going and, you know, making sure they're shrouding everyone and they know their spots for this and that and jumping ahead of the group and doing stuff. It's like, or like vanishing off certain mechanics or cloaking them and whatnot, say like Motherlode third boss or King's Rest third boss and whatever. Like there is that element of suddenly, yes, their DPS rotation is less difficult, but mechanically their responsibility is higher.
Sure. I mean, I don't think you could argue against that.
Yeah.
Within reason, I don't think that some of the mechanics in it, like, I don't think blinding something is, you know, particularly.
Yeah.
And it's not like a high frequency thing, but like, I get where you're going. But let's pull it back for a sec, because the direction I wanted, or one of the points I wanted to make with the whole skill capping thing to Feral versus some other things, is really a more meta issue that it's a more daunting barrier to entry for players, right? So when players look and they see, hey, you know, I could play something like Outlaw or Havoc, which brings so much utility, right? So much power. Havoc, we'll pick on Havoc. It's kind of become a theme and a meme, but the truth is that there's a reason for that, right? They're just so powerful. They're more simplistic. They bring a ton of tools in both rating and M+, and ultimately achieve the same numerical value as Feral. So you're kind of trapped in this situation, it seems like, at least from an outside perspective, where Feral doesn't really bring much else. In fact, it brings less than others and is more difficult to play. So that creates a daunting player experience for new players that might want to get involved in that community. Not guys like yourselves that are obviously really well versed in the class, but then it's hard to get that class representation. And do you think that maybe that ends up not catching the eye of Blizzard as much? Maybe that's why you have a lack of changes, lack of attention to utility and things like that, because you have an underrepresented population?
Yeah,
potentially.
Yeah,
I don't think the whole catching the eye of Blizzard thing has much sort of truth to it, because obviously sort of we had Celestalon, who was a long-time Feral player and who certainly paid attention to Feral, and we kind of stayed the same then as well. I don't really think it's sort of a representation-driven thing.
Mm-hmm.
I do think, and obviously you can look at live Feral now. So obviously you mentioned that you didn't play live Feral, you don't have really a border of comparison here. But genuinely, live Feral, I think, is probably easier than playing Demon Hunter. And from my experience, sort of, this is my guide writing hat on for a little second here,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of the helping people hat, is that when I've talked to people who are struggling with Feral, or who were nervous about getting started with Feral, in almost all of the instances, it was people overcomplicating it for themselves, and thinking that Feral has this reputation, and it's sort of, we're back to the reputation, the stigma here. Feral has this reputation of being really hard. And that sort of stuck around, much as the reputation of Feral not being very good has stuck around.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of one and the same. And they're just overcomplicating it for themselves in their heads. Because live Feral is just about as simple as it's possible to make a class.
Yeah.
But people still find it daunting.
I think.
So I do think there's just a case of Feral is just, the way Feral plays in terms of dots isn't similar to most of the other melee. I think that does psych people out.
Yeah. And yeah, I think because we have, like, with some other specs, so say Enhancement Shaman, when you use your abilities, they go on a cooldown. So you go, oh, well, I've kind of gotten rid of, like, that light is no longer, like, that button's no longer pressable for a bit. So, like, you can kind of, it reduces the amount of things that you have to pay attention to. Whereas with Feral, because none of our buttons have a cooldown, suddenly, because you can press anything whenever, it causes that trap of like, oh, what should I be pressing? And I think that is definitely something that could make it seem more difficult and more daunting to get involved in, because you have that freedom to press anything at all times. But I also think Feral is, like, the complexity of Feral, I think it's easy, like, it has like 5 different rotations that are all easy rotations within themselves. But because it has all, like, Demon Hunter, you always I-beam, you always Blade Dance, you always whatever the other one is, right? And that's it, no matter how many mobs there are. And so that's easy to understand. I think Feral has, depending, like, if you go from 1 mob to 2 mobs, you change rotation. If you go from 2 to 3, you slightly change rotation. If you go from 3 to 4, you change rotation again. And then if you go from 6 or more, you change rotation again. So there's, like, all these different points where you do change your rotation and have a list of priority that does change. And I think people aren't aware of that as intrinsically, unless they've tested a lot of it, or like speak to people in the community and whatnot. So I definitely think there is a complexity to Feral. It's just seen in a different light, potentially.
But I mean, don't you think you guys have played it on beta, right?
Yeah.
I would assume.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
do you not think that complexity increases on beta compared to live?
It does marginally.
Yeah.
In fact, it does a decent amount because Sabretooth is gone.
And Blood Talents change, I think, is actually more complex now.
I think the way it is now
way.
is probably less complex, personally. But
Well, I
think it's probably more complicated. Yeah. Yes. And this is probably me having played Feral for long enough that it is now hard for me to distinguish. I don't feel like it's hard to play, personally. Obviously, you're new to the spec, you feel like it's hard to play, so that's certainly something to consider. And maybe it could... I kind of don't want to say it to simplify it, because I'd rather shoot myself than play Havoc Demon Hunter Simulator for the next 2 years.
In game, of course. In game, of course. Don't worry. I got you covered, Slew. Don't worry. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe there is a problem with that. It's a hard problem to fix.
Keep in mind, this is all relative, right? This isn't like an EP flex of this class is just generally extremely hard. It like everything needs to exist in a relative bubble of the level of difficulty, skill capping, and utility that other classes bring, that Feral does or doesn't, right? And all of these things need to be balanced for the general player base. We're not talking just top M plus, top raiders, top whatever. We're talking anybody, right? So in terms of a barrier to entry for Feral, I think they certainly have a higher one than some of the other classes and specs that we mentioned.
Yeah.
On the flip side, though, we have known, and I think like historically Blizzard has stated, for things like Feral, like Havoc, that they do like, and they do on purpose design some classes to be just more simple so that they're easier for new players to pick up, though. But that kind of creates, in a way, a community building issue for some of the other specs like Windwalker and Feral.
Yeah. So my thoughts here are, there's 36 specs, different strokes for different folks. Some people might not enjoy the Feral playstyle, and that's okay. There's other stuff that they can play. Some people might enjoy the Feral playstyle, and if they do, then it's there. I have no problem with as a Feral and sort of as whatever. I have no problem with Feral being low represented. I somewhat have faith in Blizzard to tune stuff reasonably, which is my primary concern. Regardless of representation, and I don't necessarily think that there is a need for everything to appeal to everyone.
Okay, I think that's fair.
Yeah. I do think it is. Yeah. I do think it is not super beginner friendly, but I think if you do make it more beginner friendly, you compromise what makes the spec beautiful. Oh, that sounded really lame to say. I think it's now going to get more complex, and I think you speak to me, speak to Guilty. We like that bleed style. I think a lot of people in chat probably like that bleed style. The addition of these legendaries like the Jagged Wounds legendary and whatnot is going to make Feral a little bit more complex to play. So I guess in a sense, like, prepare for that. But yeah, I think if you simplified Feral any more than it currently is, then I think people like myself and Guilty would probably move away from it, because there wouldn't be enjoyment there, and then we wouldn't. Like, at least now when you play Feral, you kind of feel a little bit good, even if your damage isn't representing that. You still kind of feel like it feels fun and stuff, and it feels kind of, in a way, complex. But yeah, I think if they make it more beginner friendly, it will compromise it a bit.
Okay, that's fair. We've kind of started already diving and bleeding at the seams in some different areas about Talons. So might as well just dive into the Talons right now and start chatting about them. Now, you two can handle this technically however you want, because just different shows we've had so far, and I'm sure this will continue, like, kind of either just highlighted the important things, like we've talked about Sabretooth and Blood Talons already, and Linkarn, or lack of Inkarn. So there's things that have mentioned. You guys can also just take it tree by tree if this is like a cookie cutter kind of spec that we've seen in other ones. But I mean, the floor is yours in terms of SL talent base moving into it, and kind of Definitely, I do want to talk a bit about Blood Talons. Sabretooth we've talked about. So if you guys want to touch on Blood Talons at some point while you splurge, because that's already gone through 2 iterations to try and make it essentially easier than its first version in SL. I'm not sure if it's the same version as on live. But the floor is yours, Sai. Why don't you start with you?
Yeah, sure. So obviously we've had changes to Sabretooth, which, I mean, I think me and Guilty both agree that we prefer, like, I prefer the execute phase of Sabretooth. So I actually personally would want to see Sabretooth potentially removed as a talent and made more baseline, but in the execute phase. And ultimately, I would probably look to make put Feral Frenzy in its place, potentially. Maybe like a weakened form or something like that. Because then you have a row where you have a single target option, a cleave option in the form of Lunar Inspiration, which is now looking a lot stronger as well, and could even potentially, I don't know, I've not run the numbers like maybe Guilty has, but I think Lunar Inspiration could potentially compete with Sabretooth in a single target or like in a raid scenario, especially with some of the legendaries going on. But we would have a single target option, a cleave, and then a mass AoE in the form of Predator. You would then have, yeah, I think that could be a good option. There's also problems with Scent of Blood. Scent of Blood has actually been nerfed. Like, Scent of Blood got implemented, and it did not get picked. From the moment it was implemented to now, it has not been picked once. And not only that, it's now been nerfed because Scent of Blood benefits your swipe, and swipe has just been put on a 5 target cap. So now there's even less reason to use that when you have Primal Wrath, which is untarget capped, right? And applies bleed to everything, or rip to everything. You then have Brutal Slash as an option, which again is a cleave option, but is actually the prime pick in a single target situation. So you have Brutal Slash as single target, then you have 2 AoE talents that compete with one another, and Primal Wrath always wins. And even if they buff Scent of Blood where it suddenly wins, well, now Primal Wrath is useless because now this fills the AoE niche. So I think this is another row of talents that should have a single target, a cleave, and a clear AoE winner. And then it becomes a case of, like, yeah, there's not great meaningful choice in terms of, like, really, you know, theory crafting what is the best option, but at least every talent has a place to be played. That's my personal input. But I think one row of talents that really, really, really bothers me more than anything in Feral is the level 40 row, which is Soul of the Forest, Savage Roar, and Incarn. And the reason that this row bothers me so much is because it doesn't work. Like, you're not rewarded for the complexity of the gameplay. So Soul of the Forest is a passive talent that just, you play the game as you normally would, you don't think about it, it just does a thing, right? And it is the best choice in that row. The next option is Savage Roar, which is something that is a combo point finisher. So you lose one finisher every time you look to use it. It has a maintenance, so you have to make sure that you're remembering to apply it every so often. And yeah, so it's a finisher and it's a maintenance buff. And then you have Incarn, which is a long cooldown, like just a long cooldown ability. So you're punished for the fact that you only get use of that every 3 minutes, right? And Savage Roar and Incarn are both weaker than just the passive talent. And I think that is, sorry, Blizzard, I think that's bad game design. I don't think the passive talent should ever win, or shouldn't regularly win. Like, I feel if there's a passive choice, it should be the beginner talent that you use when you're getting used to a spec. When I go and look at a new spec, the first thing I do is select every single passive talent that I possibly can. And then, fewer things on my bar. And then, as you work up the table, it should become more rewarding and more complex. So the 40 talent row for me is very troublesome. And then apart from that, we've already kind of touched on the affinities and Heart of the Wild. I'm kind of happy with what Guilty says, where Innovate should go in the place of Balance Affinity, and then Typhoon should go in the place of Heart of the Wild.
So let me just interject for 1 second, because I'm curious on your thought here. You mentioned that I don't disagree, by the way, with the sentiment that an active ability should require a higher level of skill input, whether it's minor, right? Nonetheless, it's still something that you actively have to use. So Savage Roar and Incarn being something that should technically, with a good play reward, a better yield than SOTF. But you know,
It's
so
something Ion brought up as well.
so in your opinion, then should we should a talent row ever be hybrid? Should there be mixed passives and actives, or should it either just be all passives or all actives?
That's a good question. I mean, like I said, when I pick up a new spec, I try and take as many passes as I can to reduce the number of buttons on my bar, and let me just kind of get a feel for the base play style before I go and add complexity. So I actually think having passive and active options mixed is a good play.
Okay.
Because yeah, I think it allows you to add on complexity to your play style as you get more comfortable. And I think that's a good progression as a player. You know, you feel stronger, like you feel smarter and whatever.
Okay.
You just feel that physical, I'm getting better at the spec.
Then as a follow-up to that, though,
Yeah.
right? Let's say you have 2 passives and an active, right? And as
Yeah.
you're saying, you kind of progress through them. Maybe one passive is completely passive. Maybe one passive has a little proc associated with it. And then you have the active after, and you kind of progress through these in terms of expertise of playing the class. Then we start to kind of get into a situation where you're not really choosing between talents anymore, right? Rather, you're just progressing your play, and then you're trapped into the one best talent ultimately when you master the class. So it starts to defeat the purpose of choice in a talent tree.
Well, I think the choice then, it's a different style of choice. So then it's the choice of, it's a choice of complexity. Like, how complex do you want your spec to be? But I guess that's a bigger question in terms of how talents should operate.
Mm-hmm.
I think talents should add on to the base level of gameplay that you have in a spec. So talents should interact with the base toolkit.
Okay.
In my opinion.
I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a couple of things I want to approach here.
Yeah.
So there's one guy in chat, Jabs23, who apparently has a ginormous brain, and he said talent should never be theorycrafting the best option. If it becomes that, then the row has failed its purpose, which I think has a lot of truth to it. So the level 45 row that you mentioned, and you mentioned how it should be you should add a single target row to it. So the intention of this row, as it was added in 8.1, was to give Feral a specifically AoE row. So that was its original purpose. So the reason that it was added was because for a long time we had talent rows that were, as you suggested, were sort of single target, was cleave, and was AoE. So what this resulted in is in a situation whereby, in order to be able to AoE on a fight, or be able to opt into more AoE, you sacrificed a significant amount of single target. So if it was a fight which had, say, intermixed AoE and single target, like, say, I'm blanking on a fight right at the moment, but potentially Vexiona. So there's AoE on Vexiona, but for the most part, and for the most important part of the fight, what you care about is single target to the boss. So in the last phase, and for when there aren't ads up. But you still want to be able to take AoE. So if you put a single target talent on this row, what happens then is on Vexiona, do you want to be able to contribute to the ads, but sacrifice a significant amount of your contribution to the boss? Or do you want to be able to contribute to the boss, but then feel relatively useless on the ads? So that's why this row should stay AoE. Like, it should only have AoE rows. And I think that you've brought a good point in that Scent of Blood and Primal Wrath, they do the same thing. Functionally, they're not the same talent, but they fit the exact same niche. So Brutal Slash and Primal Wrath kind of have different niches, and Brutal Slash's niche isn't as enforced as it probably should be. So it should really be the burst AoE talent, and Primal Wrath should be the sustained AoE talent. So that's not as enforced as much as it should be. And Scent of Blood it could be good, but if it is good, then as you said, Primal Wrath will be useless. But that row should stay full AoE, because otherwise it brings these awkward choices where you're like,
yeah.
stuck.
I'm happy to agree. Like, if it is going to be like, I know where you're going with that whole AoE row, and I think it's good that Feral does have a pure AoE row. But I just think that with 3 talent choices, you have Brutal Slash, which is the single target / burst cleave kind of.
Yeah, so that could be that needs to be better enforced.
So, like, yeah,
yes.
what do you do with Scent of Blood? I mean, I thought about putting Feral Frenzy in the place of Scent of Blood, but I mean, if you're saying, yeah, like, not having that single target, like, just keeping it pure AoE, but then that just comes down to a case of, well, you have 2 AoE talents. We'll exclude Brutal Slash because that's kind of taken on single target and whatever. you got Center Blood and Primal Wrath, and one of them has to be stronger. So then, like, what do you do with that? What do you do with that row? Again, one's a passive,
really,
one is an active, or like is an additional button. So I guess there's that sense of progression.
So I can touch on my thoughts on that as well. But really, I think the answer is that you make one of them a lower target. So you make one, maybe this is better on 3 target AoE. So maybe it's your rake hits 3 targets as opposed to 1 target. And then that drives another niche of AoE while still enforcing its existence as an AoE row, whereby your choice isn't based on, is this fight an AoE fight or is it a single target fight, which is more important, but it's based on, this is an AoE fight. How do I drive this? What's the way I want to do my AoE? Is it I want to be able to put rake on lots of things and cleave that way? Is it that I want to AoE rip and rip everything on my screen? Or is it that I want to kill these ads in 3 GCDs? I think that's the way this talent row needs to go, as opposed to adding a single target and creating this sort of friction of choice.
I could get on board with that. I do think that there is then that level of thought of what you read the situation and you plan accordingly, and I think that is a good mentality to have when approaching any interaction in WoW, like whether it be a raid boss or a mythic plus, like whatever. You kind of plan ahead and you're either rewarded or punished based on what decision you made and whether you made the right one or not. I could look to get on board with that. Yeah, but I still would be okay with it being a single target talent instead of Scent. Like I could be happy with it. I could also be happy with the full AoE, but I don't think Scent of Blood should stay as it is now.
Well, I could talk about passives now as well. So obviously this is something Ion said as well, right? That a passive should be worse than an active. So what I'd like to talk about is, what about passives that are more complicated than actives? So obviously we had an earlier iteration of Blood Talons, whereby it was 3 seconds duration, and it required Rake, Thrash, and Shred. That version of Blood Talons was completely passive, but it was objectively far more complicated. Can't talk all of a sudden. Far more complicated than Feral Frenzy. So in that case, do you still think that the active choice should be better than the passive choice?
Yeah, that's a good point. But I think that's a very unique case with Blood Talons. I think Blood Talons depends on what form of Blood Talons, right? But I think the rendition of Blood Talons that you were discussing, the 3 second window, was probably the most punishing, like one of the most punishing.
Oh, no, don't get me wrong. I agree entirely. I'm not necessarily arguing for that.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you then compare it to Blood Talons as in BFA, which is get up to 4/5 combo points, then regrowth, then you use the finisher and either refresh your rake if you need to, or just either shred or swipe. Like, as long as you're not thrashing, basically you're winning. And that isn't a complex form of it. So I think it just depends on the complexity of I guess it depends on the complexity, but I think it's not very often, like if you look at something, say like Predator, that's not a very complex passive. I think I do agree that passives can be complex, but I don't think they oftentimes are.
I think you also need to just remember, just to cut in for a sec here, I don't mean to interrupt, but the tier talent as well is important, right? Like you just compared Predator, that's a T1 talent, to a T7 talent. T7s are meant to be beefy, right? Like the beefiest of them all. Do you guys like the current iteration of Blood Talons now? Like the final, well, what is currently the final version right now in beta?
So Blood Talons has gone through a few iterations, hasn't it?
Yep.
So it started as requiring a finisher. So it was Ferocious Bite, Rake, and Shred, which I was a big fan of. And then it was 3 seconds, Rake, Shred, and Thrash. And then it was 5 seconds, Rake, Shred, and Thrash. And now it's 5 seconds, any 3 different combo point generators. I am kind of indifferent to it. I think the early iterations were really good. I think this current iteration has some problems. Namely the existence of Brutal Slash. So Brutal Slash costs 20 energy. And Brutal Slash is counted as one of the different generators. And Brutal Slash is already a button that you want to press on single target. So the problem there becomes that 25 energy, sorry. The problem there becomes that the total energy cost for proccing your Blood Talons becomes less than the amount of energy you generate naturally during that Blood Talons window. It also means that quite frequently, so we, thanks to Gas Tank, who's a boomkin, who's been doing some Simcraft implementation for Feral this go around, he's been doing a really good job. So I just remembered him and I want to shout him out quickly. But thanks to him, we have a working Feral simulator now. So we plugged in the existing APL, and I think without any modifications for Blood Talons, so without any modifications for thinking about when you press your buttons to ensure you proc Blood Talons, it has something like a 50%, 50-60% uptime on the finishers, which I think is quite high for what is a talent with reasonably stringent requirements. And that's probably fine. I think it plays okay even still, but I don't think it Brutal Slash works particularly well in it, because I think it just has too much where you proc it automatically and there's no thought in it.
Okay.
Yeah, I would jump on that and say I initially, when I saw this, thought, oh, this is really cool because now it is like a buff to Lunar Inspiration, forgetting the fact that obviously you can just Brutal Slash instead. And I think it would be pretty cool with the addition of Lunar Inspiration, because at least, like, yes, it's still a comparable low energy cost compared to like something like Shred, but at least it's a maintenance start, and it's an additional button to kind of keep aware of. I think Blood Talons initially in the earlier renditions was extremely punishing, to the point where if you pulled your energy slightly, like just not quite right, then it went to a point where you had 5 combo points and you didn't have a Blood Talon snapped finisher. So or empowered finisher, I should say. So you then had to either expend your combo points on an Blood Talons empowered finisher, which felt really bad in the case of Rip and pretty bad in the case of Ferocious Bite, or you had to remain at 5 combo points, pool up energy all over again, and then rebuild that Blood Talons with those 3 builders. So I feel like the earlier renditions were very punishing, and I also felt like they didn't feel very fluid depending on what content you were doing. So if you go into a Mythic Plus scenario where you have moments of AoE and moments of, well, like boss fights or low mob count, well, single target, I should specify, then neither of those rotations feel good, really. Even still, neither of those rotations feel good with the current rendition of Blood Talon. So in Mythic Plus, it is likely that you're running Predator, Primal Wrath, Moment of Clarity, or, well, yeah, I guess in this case you take Blood Talons. So you take Predator, you take Primal Wrath, and then you take Blood Talons, right? So on AoE, you have to either use Rake or Shred in order to proc your Blood Talons, which neither ability particularly feels good. And the more AoE or the more mobs you throw into that mix, the worse it feels. So like on 2 to 3 targets, it feels pretty good to use Rake, and it's actually like the best course of action. But as soon as you start to get to, like, 6-7 mobs or whatever, then suddenly raking or shredding in that environment does not feel good. So thrash and swiping in that environment feels very good, but one of 3 of those generators just feels bad. And then in that same talent setup, you then go on to, say, a boss, and then suddenly you have to either you have to thrash on single target, which again doesn't feel particularly good because its damage isn't very good. Now,
hello, Guardian.
So suddenly shredding and raking on single target feels really good, but thrashing feels really bad. So in the current rendition of Blood Talons, it still never feels like Goldilocks, right? It still never feels perfect to do that rotation. The only thing I can say is, as we start to get access to things like conduits, such as the conduit where for each bleed on the target, your Ferocious Bite does X amount of increased damage, suddenly Thrash does feel better to use on single target, but it never feels fully, like, you're never super pumped about it because it's high energy cost and it's kind of designed around being an AoE ability. So I personally don't love new Blood Talons. I also like just saying Guilty, like you can just, without even really thinking about it, maintain a very high uptime on Blood Talons procs just by pressing any random buttons, right? But I think that's actually a bad thing. It's not very beginner friendly, because sometimes when that kind of alignment doesn't occur and you haven't pulled your energy properly, and there are times when I'll be doing keys and I haven't thought about it, and I've been talking and running my mouth, and then suddenly I'm like, oh no, I'm at 5 combat points and I didn't actually do my Blood Talons rotation. And I'm like, oh no, okay. And then that feels really bad. And as somebody who talks a lot, I need it to be different because I talk too much, so I won't pay attention. No, but I think it's still, it's definitely in the best rendition, personally, in my opinion. It's been on, or it's had in Shadowlands so far in the beta, but it's definitely less punishing than it used to be.
What would you like to change to it, since you're kind of midway yes and no on it?
See, something minor like Lunar Inspiration being the go-to talent in Mythic Plus would fix it, because then Lunar Inspiration would feel good. If it was like strong enough where it felt good in AoE and single target, then like that would fix it, because then it would just kind of bridge the gap. But I don't think that that's a good decision. I don't think with 10 mobs in a pack you should be Lunar Inspiration, you should be Moonfiring. I don't know. I actually think the current live rendition, it's not interesting, but it works, right? Whereas right now, it's still not super interesting, and it sometimes just doesn't feel great, right? So on live, it currently works where when you regrowth, the next two, regrowth or entangle, the next two abilities are increased by, 20% damage or 25% damage or whatever. I'm struggling to think now. I'm in Shadowlands mindset, but that you just kind of build up to 4 combo points, and then you either rake to refresh your bleed if you need to, or if you don't need to rake, you assess the situation. If it's single target, you shred. If it's AoE, you swipe. And then you use it on one of your finishers. That's where you use the second proc on. And that at least works no matter what the situation is, and it isn't dependent on single target or AoE, and you can use whatever rotation you want to get up to that point. So that at least works. I don't know, Guilty. I feel like you'd kind of be against that idea, and I'd be interested to see what chat has on that. But if Shadowlands releases with the current iteration of Blood Talons, I wouldn't begrudge it, and I just kind of, it's one of those where the more you practice it, the more it just kind of will fall in line and feel okay. I feel like it doesn't feel great on AoE. It doesn't feel great on single target.
I think that's part of the intended design. I think it's intended to have some modicum of friction in terms of pressing an ability that you don't normally press.
Yeah, I could get on board with that. It feels really good in raid, though, right? Like well, not like it feels really good, but like it works because, like you're saying, you can rake, shred, and brutal slash, and if you really want, you can take Lunar Inspiration if you want, and that even fits into that boat. So on single target and in a raid environment, I feel like it's got no real problems, apart from, like you're saying, you just don't really enjoy it.
I think what we're getting at is that your problem with it is the opposite of the problem with my problem with it, which is fine. It's personal preference. But yes, I think the intended design of it is that you are pressing an ability that you don't normally press in order to proc it.
Yeah, which just doesn't feel good, though. Like that doesn't. Pressing a button which you know is inefficient, like thrashing on single target, doesn't feel good. Like, just because you have to do it, it's inefficient, and you know in your head this is inefficient, because I would much rather shred right now or rake. So I don't get. Yeah.
What if there was a proc? Say Blood Talons was replaced with a proc that when you cast finishers, you have a 15% chance to make your next thrash do 500% damage.
Yeah.
Would you still have an issue with pressing thrash on single target?
Well, no, because then I know that it is actually like. Well, yeah, I guess it's the same thing as. I guess you're getting at it's the same thing as like that is what it is now. But it's still just. I don't know. It still just doesn't feel good, but I know it is the right call.
That's fine. At the end of the day, you just don't enjoy pressing that. There's not really a whole lot. They could redesign it to be something different.
Yeah.
But yes, it's just converting that inefficient button press into an efficient button press.
Yeah, but like I say, it'll gain value with that conduit where the more bleeds you have and stuff like that, and like it'll I guess start to feel more beneficial. But I know obviously mathematically it is the best option.
Yeah, certainly that
use it.
conduit that increases ferocious bite damage by I think it scales up to like
3%
or something.
No, it scales up to 7.2, right?
Is it 7.2? Yeah.
7.2, I
Bleed
believe,
is-
something like that.
That's reasonably ludicrous. I'm looking forward to that. That seems like a
Yeah.
lot to play with.
Yeah, you end up like 21% increased bleed damage or whatever, ferocious bite damage, which is pretty nuts. Just from that, plus you take Sabertooth with it, like plus blood talents, like you're rocking on ferocious bites. Yeah.
Big bite damage.
So it doesn't seem. I mean, there's definitely some points of contention in the tree generally, but it doesn't seem like you guys have gone through every tier and been like, these are all crap. These are all crap. I have a huge issue with this. It seems like Heart of the Wild seems a no-no. Sabertooth seems a bit of a no-no.
Yeah.
And Blood Talons Blood Talons and Brutal Slash versus the rest of its row seems to be at least points of discussion.
Scent of Blood is the other issue that I raised. Savage Roar is a point of discussion.
Yeah.
But it's mainly people who like Savage Roar versus people who don't like Savage Roar.
I would go into that if I were you, because I know a lot of people I've spoken to actually really like Savage Roar, and I know that the way that you spoke about it made me go, oh yeah, actually I don't like Savage Roar anymore. So why don't you go into that?
I used to really like Savage Roar. Savage Roar used to be a very interesting button to press, despite the fact that it was just a pure buff. I think nowadays in modern WoW, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I quite like the gameplay of having 3 finishers. But I don't think Savage Roar is the finisher that it should be. So I think that should be replaced because I think it's, frankly, an antiquated talent. It used a snapshot, which made it kind of interesting, but now it doesn't snapshot. It's kind of not hugely interesting.
Yeah.
It doesn't really bring anything behind besides just a...
And it doesn't really change your gameplay. It's just a case of every 30 seconds I press this button, and that's...
Well, it changes your gameplay in terms of you need to track it and you need to think about it and you need to make sure that you have the resources to keep it up. But I think it's just a bit antiquated and it probably shouldn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
I think it mostly exists because they didn't want to remove it fully because it's reasonably iconic. And I think it's probably time to just get rid of it and put something more interesting there.
You gotta love those maintenance buffs.
Yeah.
There's a few that Inquisition. There's a few that exist, but
slice and dice.
All right, so good talent breakdown. There one side thing before we get into a quick Covenant talk. Is Swipe capped on live for 5 target, or is that new?
Yeah, 5.
No, that's
sorry, not on live now.
No, okay, so that is a
Shadowlands. Yes.
that's the only thing that you guys have suffered in terms of
Swipe
capping.
and Brutal Slash are both target capped.
Yeah, but like Primal Wrath uncapped, Thrash all uncapped,
Yep.
as you just joked about it. So that, in a world where we do have this kind of AoE capping, and it seems to be kind of a hot topic, could be something that works in your favor. To be fair, I don't really know what kind of damage breakdown you usually have from Brutal Slash or Swipe, so that actually might be not something that works in your favor. But there are classes, so far at least, that are melee speaking, that are definitely a bit worse off than you are in terms of AoE capping. So
For sure.
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely.
could be something that helps.
Yeah. There's some nice... Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a nice legendary that actually works very comfortably with that. There's a legendary based off of an old tier set. I think it was like Legion tier set. And Taurus, where for each... every tick of rip has a 4% chance to make your next ferocious, or to give you a ferocious bite that is at max potency. So as if you'd pulled 50 energy and you had 5 combo points, and that could end up being very, very strong as like a primary target, like kind of pummeler. So similar to, I guess, how like Fire Mage works, where you kind of like ramp up on a single target or whatever, it would kind of be like that. And the more mobs that you pull in for AoE, I mean, obviously Primal Wrath is then uncapped, so you just get that base damage of Primal Wrath does damage on hit, applies rip to everything, and then with use of that legendary, you can... I'm at a point where, like, if you have enough mobs, it's like 10 or so mobs, you just get like proc after proc after proc, and you basically just become like a ferocious bite like machine, and you just funnel ferocious bites into a primary target, whilst also like doing very consistent bleed damage to everything else around you, and that's looking really good for like large AoE pulls and stuff like that.
Good for everybody's favorite bolstering week.
Yes.
All right, gentlemen, talk to me. We don't have to go too crazy in depth because we do want to get through the rest of the topics. We still have some time, don't worry. But talk to me about covenants here. What's I don't want to be that guy that's like, what's the best covenant for Feral? But from a mechanical standpoint, because that's really the direction we have to head in.
I'm pretty sure, by the way. In case anyone was curious, I'm pretty sure Night Fae is numerically the best.
But from a mechanical standpoint, assuming damage-wise, let's say they're all going to be even, however that may turn out. From a mechanical standpoint, what kind of tickles your fancy here? Why don't you start, Guilty?
So we have Night Fae, obviously I've brought that up. So Night Fae is 4-second channel, it casts 16 spells. It's not random. It might say it's random, it's not random, it's deterministic, it's all okay. You can channel while moving. It's quite interesting, it's reasonably bursty. It has some interactions with our talents in that it consumes blood talons, and it also extends Rip via Sabertooth. And if you have Lunar Inspiration, it will cast Lunar Inspiration Moonfire rather than normal Moonfire. So that one's pretty interesting. It comes with Soul Shape, which is obviously the Blink, which has been made better. And then they removed the Shadow Mend, which is less ideal, but we won't complain too much about that. So Night Fae is pretty good. We've got Venthyr. Venthyr is a 3-minute cooldown, and it's a 20-second stacking buff that stacks with every ability you use. And it gives you haste and damage, and if you have a Covenant, it will also give you crit. It plays okay. It's not very good for our damage profile, though with the Conduit that it gives it crit chance as well, it will probably be pretty good. One problem that's a little bit toxic is it stacks with non-GCD abilities.
Yes.
So if you make a macro that casts Tiger's Fury, Kick, Dash, Survival Instinct, Spark Skin, and basically every non-GCD ability, and you macro that all together, you press Ravenous Frenzy, and you press your macro, and you use all of your utility, but you get like 7 stacks, so...
Yeah. So you can jump up to what, like, above like 30
gameplay.
stacks. Yeah, that's degenerate gameplay, but...
It's extremely degenerate gameplay, and it should probably be removed, but we'll see if that happens, or whether or not I'm Bark Skinning and Survival Instincts for damage again.
Yeah, I'm glad that they gave us Bark Skin now, because now we get to an additional stack on it. So
yep, the guy not like thising in chat is entirely accurate. It's entirely like this.
Yeah.
Necrolord is a dot which also increases the damage of your dots. So we've got a nice little sheet here where I put notes, and I've mentioned on here that Necrolord is a balanced nightmare. So the reason Necrolord is a balanced nightmare is because Covenants are class specific, and Balance and Feral have very different distributions for dot damage. I'm sure everyone can see where the problem is we're going with here. If it's good for Feral, then it's awful for Balance, and if it's good for Balance, then it's really, really good for Feral. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to address that. It looks like they're addressing it by just moving the power into the damage of the dots, but it's not a particularly interesting button to press. You basically press it on cooldown.
I don't know. I love it. I think it's just fun looking and fun. I enjoy it more than the other Druid ones personally. But then
Really?
this is coming from a Guardian perspective, I suppose.
I think it's pretty cool,
Fair
and
enough.
like you can like pre-apply it to yourself, and you can like kind of have some kind of back and forth in the jumps of it and stuff. I think it's somewhat interesting, but yeah, I think it's good in a raid environment. I don't think it's good outside of it. It's good in like raid or PvP, right? Like in arena, it would be good, but I think outside.
I think it'll probably end up being the best one for PvP. But yes,
Yeah.
I think it is. I think it's a mess because it doesn't have any AOE value, and all of the others have AOE value.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
That's
for
a bit
sure.
awkward for the Covenant system. We also have Kirian abilities. Sorry, somebody just asked if it counts towards the Ferocious Bite damage legendary, and no, it does not. It's a conduit, and it's not a bleed, so it doesn't stack. But we also have Kirian. Kirian works weirdly, which is a way to put it. So the way it works is you link to somebody, and then when you use an active ability, which is on a 1-minute cooldown, for 10 seconds, you and the person you've linked to will give each other a pool of damage, which you will then use to empower your abilities. So it's 30% damage. You need to do damage in order to spend it. So if you deal 100 damage, you'll only spend 30 damage. So an original concern was just linked to somebody who does a lot more DPS than you, and they give you infinite DPS. But that concern has been addressed via that. So at maximum, it's 60% of your damage over that 10 seconds, which is fine. Which is fine. It has problems in that that damage is also used for healing. So if they press any healing buttons or anything like that, then it will steal some of your damage. And there's also a problem in that, and this is a bit of a nitpicky problem, because it doesn't actually change the power of the Covenant, right? But at the moment, the damage, half the damage it deals is distributed to the person you linked with. So this doesn't actually change the value of the Covenant, but it does make it feel less good to use, because you're giving someone else damage, you're not getting that damage. It's not going to be very good for passing.
You strike me as somebody who
everyone cares about.
You strike me as somebody who doesn't like support-based spells in this game.
Oh god, fuck my friends. Nah, fuck that. I'm in it for me.
Game, of course. I think Kirian is interesting though when you say, like, if you were potentially to apply it to your tank, and it can actually end up being used as a defensive ability, which I think is really good. So you can, I'm trying to think of how it actually works with the Guardian. Yeah, so 40% of the damage that you take is like redirected to, I believe, it just get like redirected to your tank, which is really awesome in, say, like a Mythic Plus environment where, so say in Mythic Plus, second boss under art, where you know there's going to be tantrums, like you could use that every second tantrum, and boom, you just get like a 40% redirection of damage, which is really cool. Or if you link up to a healer, your healer replicates 50% of all the healing they do onto you, so they can just ignore you completely, and 50% of all the healing they're doing is going on to you. So, like, depending on what the fight is, it couples as either a prevention of damage or as a quick healer. So, like, if you're going to go to King Terest first boss with the Spit Gold, that's not something that you necessarily would use like a prevention on, but it's something that like you heal up after each tick or whatever, you know? So like that is really powerful in that aspect. So I could see it being strong in a Mythic Plus environment. The problem with Kirian is just it's not super interesting. Like Convoke interacts with your spec. And that is really cool. But and same with like Venthyr in a sense, where you're saying like you can proc a bunch of like GCDs and stuff, and it does at least that like cool element of it. But Kirian isn't very interesting, really. Yeah.
No. Yes, that's basically it.
Yeah.
You're right. There is some interesting gameplay in terms of maybe I could link it to a tank, maybe I could link it to a healer. I think that's more of a Mythic Plus thing. To be fair. Though, to be fair, my healers don't heal me anyway, and when they do heal me, it's to kill me on Raden, so linking to a healer might be pretty good.
Yep, there you go. Force them to heal you, whether they like it or not.
The life of a feral.
One heal, please, in the chat.
At least you get invited,
yes.
dude, so, you know.
So given as they are now, let's say it's just numbers tuning from now on, which direction are you both headed in from a performance perspective? Well, not including conduits and soulbinds. I know that's part of it. We'll touch on that in just a moment. But just in terms of these abilities, where does your head lie, and does it match the lore fun reason that you're picking that covenant, or no?
So I'll jump in on that. I am like, when I saw these covenants being released, I was like, it's an RPG, man. I'm probably gonna go Night Fae because I like the transmog. And if I feel good and I look good, then I'm gonna do good. You know what I mean? And that's what it's all about. No, but I liked the addition of Night Fae, or of Convoke. I am someone who is going to be primarily Mythic Plus focused and not Raid focused. So yes, I want to perform well in Raid, but I'm not a world first like Raider kind of dude. Though I do hear that Pieces are recruiting for their Raid team at the minute, so we'll see how things go. But yeah, so my focus is Mythic Plus. So I'm looking at Convoke because it looks very strong for Mythic Plus based on a few legendaries and conduits and whatnot. And like I said, that cool little gimmicky thing where you can jump into Boomkin and do a bunch of like, you know, Starfall damage and have your Primal Wrath and whatnot. But I think I'll probably end up going for that one, though I would like to just caveat that and say, chat, if your goal is different from mine, then a conduit or a covenant, your best and slot covenant might differ from what mine is. But yeah, so far I'm looking at Night Fae or Venthia, because I think Venthia looks really good as well and could potentially compete with Convoke in terms of damage.
Thematically speaking, are those...
Thematically, see, I'd be taking a hit on the theme. I don't think Tauren Druid look great in the whole vampire thing, though maybe it's a niche, and I'm sure Elwyn Forest will be the decider eventually.
Jesus Christ.
Guilty, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll probably be picking Night Fae based on the valuers at the moment. I think it's numerically the best. I think it has interesting interactions with Talons. I think it has an OP conduit linked to it that for some reason isn't whitelisted. So Blizzard maybe look at the whitelisting things, because you whitelist everything nowadays. And I think thematically, if you're a Druid and you don't pick Night Fae, then you should probably hand in your Druid card anyway. So.
Well,
great. Now with furries and weebs, perfect. That's great for all right.
It's not so much what matches thematically. I mean more so like where would you go? Like, what's the most attractive to you thematically, or not thematically?
I'd probably end up going Night Fae.
Night Fae.
Honestly, the Night Fae zones look gorgeous. The Transmog looks okay. Yeah, basically.
The Transmog looks okay.
I'd probably say either Night Fae or Kirian, just because I love Bastion, man. Bastion is probably the most phenomenal zone they've ever created.
It does look very nice.
Insane. Yeah.
I mean, our team's killing it this expansion so far.
Oh, they always
our team
do,
is
man.
Giga
They always
smurfing.
do. Yeah.
Like, the environments are insane.
Yeah.
Some of the zones are just incredible.
Honestly, when I'm getting spam decline from keys, I'm just going to be chilling in those fields of Bastion, just waiting out the storm, you know? I'm just going to be riding it out. It's going to put me at peace. It's going to be great.
That being said, let's chat soulbinds a bit. Now, we don't need to go through every soulbind. Of course, there's 12 of them, and things are changing still. If there's anything particularly that stands out from soulbinds, feel free to interject. Otherwise, there are, of course, 4, really it's just the potency that people care about, right? I mean, you have some neat utility ones, etc. But it's your 4 feral potency conduits that are there. And from what you guys have said and what I've heard, they're actually pretty decent.
Yeah, they're actually really interesting. I think there's some interesting gameplay in them, which is, frankly, not what I expected. I expected it was just going to be, like, increased damage or whatever, but there's actually some interesting conduits. I was really happy. So we can look at those quickly. So Feral Potency 1, if I recall correctly, is the increased damage per bleed.
For Ferocious Bite, correct.
So that has interesting gameplay in that it's... for Ferocious Bites, yes. That has interesting gameplay, obviously, as it brings Thrash into the mix. I know Sai has said that he doesn't like Thrash because it's an inefficient button, which is fair enough. But
I don't mind it. I know Blizzard likes it. I know Blizzard has been throwing so many tier sets and wild flesh rending and everything to get us that. Like, Blizzard likes us using Thrash on single target, and I
think we have used Thrash on single target for a long time.
Yeah, and I just think it's silly because it's an AOE, like uncapped AOE bleed, and for me it just feels silly to use. But if I still use it, I do. I promise you, I use it. All right.
It also has interesting synergy with Feral Frenzy, making Feral Frenzy a bit burstier.
Yep.
So that's pretty cool. Feral Potency 2 is, I think, probably the least interesting one.
Yeah.
But I'm sure some people are going to like it. So that's the Rip has 10% chance to grant 3 energy.
Which I think will get really good in Mythic Plus with like the Primal Wrath thing, but again, you'll have more energy than you can actually spend it. Like, you'll just be overcapped on energy. And with Berserk being what it is, you'll have even less reason to press it. Boom.
Yep.
That's good.
But I think it's probably going to end up okay. I think Feral Potency 3 is actually my favourite. So its finishing moves have a chance per combo point to make your next Rake or Shred deal damage as though you were stealthed. So both Rake and Shred deal 100% extra damage when you cast them from stealth. And so historically, this is why Night Elf has been favoured for Druids, for Ferals at least.
Yeah.
Because Shadow Meld becomes a reasonably potent DPS CD. So at the moment, Night Elf just completely smashes any other race because you can Shadow Meld Rake. So they've got a DPS racial in terms of extra crit, and then they've also got Shadow Meld, which is a DPS racial as well.
But then you need to play Alliance.
Strong as well. But then they
Yeah.
then they need to play lands.
Yeah.
Soul Shape was OP because we got like if you played like Night Elf Soul Shape, or Night Elf Night Fae, then you had like 2 stealth resets. So it was pretty strong. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think this one is probably my favorite. I think there's interesting gameplay there in that you've got a proc you need to care about, and you'll have to sort of overlap rakes even, and pay attention to that. And it's more snapshotting gameplay. So I'm a really big fan of that potency. I was mind blown that they added that.
Yeah, you got to be smart with your rakes there, which is cool.
So yeah, that's really cool. And then Druid potency 4 is Tiger's Fury damage bonus is increased by X%.
Yeah.
Pretty simple.
Pretty simple. As we talked about, Tiger's Fury is pretty good. It's better button than Berserk. So we like that as well. Oh, and then of course there's the Night Phase one, which is while channeling Convoke the Spirits, your damage and healing are increased by %. So this is pretty cool as well. Convoke the Spirits is already a pretty big burst button, so that just makes it even bigger. As I mentioned briefly earlier, it's rather peculiar because it's not whitelisted, so it increases all damage and healing during Convoke the Spirits, including trinkets or procs or anything like that.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit bizarre.
Yeah, each one of the covenants obviously has its own potency one. So the Necrolord one on top is Adaptive Swarm, increases periodic damage by another X%. Venthyr...
it gives you crit as well.
Yep, that's right, as you mentioned earlier. And then finally, the Kirian one is... just have it here.
I can't actually recall what the Kirian one is.
Kindred Spirits Empowerment cooldown is reduced by X%.
Okay. Up to 24%. Yeah, that's a pretty big reduction, actually. I think... Yes. There's some interesting ones. The Venthyr one, in particular, probably actually makes Ravenous Swarm quite good because you crit cap quite a low amount of stacks. I think we were talking about it earlier, and I think it was like 14 stacks you crit cap, which, as mentioned, because you can pop your Swifty one-shot macro where you pop Bark Skin and Survival Instincts, you get a whole lot of stacks really quickly. So you actually crit cap quite early into Ravenous Frenzy. So you get quite a lot of stuff with 100% crit, and having 100% crit is pretty good.
That could be pretty... I'm thinking Ravenous Frenzy with, like, Incon could be, like, amounts to some insane burst damage there. It could be really good. But
your thoughts on the general potency ones, Sai? You like them?
Yeah, like I mean, I saw the Night Fae one, and that kind of, blew my mind. That's going to be so strong, especially when you're getting, like, massive Ferocious Bites in that window anyway, and then when you've got another Conduit which busts your Ferocious Bite, and you've got Sabertooth and Blood Talons. And I think, so, I mean, Guilty mentioned earlier that Night Fae or Convoke the Spirits will expend Blood Talons, but I've also seen that it has been generating Blood Talons as well, though it doesn't seem to be, like, every single time. But I have seen it able to do that. I don't know if maybe that's a bug or what, or if it's intended. But that could be really strong just with, like, massive Ferocious Bite during that Convoke window. So I'm really interested in that one. Like I just said, the 2% crit, the Venthyr is really cool. And again, could be really good in some Incon, like, burst build. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with them. In terms of the conduits as a whole, I'm very happy. Like, some of them are just kind of nice to have. And then, like, we're looking at the Rake and Tread one, that just looks really good and adds a little bit extra of awareness in terms of your raking and stuff, which is cool.
Yeah, I think in general they've kind of tried to make an emphasis on adding potency conduits, period, that have at least a little bit of skill capping to them. You know, nothing huge, but like something to at least pay attention to, a proc, a debuff, etc. I've seen it across the classes and specs, so that's a nice breath of fresh air rather than the overwhelming majority of, Azerite traits that were just like, here's 10% damage kind of thing.
More damage.
Yeah, exactly. Not the most exciting. So obviously no conduit talk is incomplete without then talking about legendaries, which you've kind of touched on before. Now there's 4 general Druid ones and of course 4 feral ones. So why don't you start with this one? Any standouts? Because I know you mentioned a couple of them before during the earlier conversation.
Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about the legendaries in general. So I mentioned previously that Feral Druid right now is like an Assassination Rogue and an Outlaw Rogue under one talent tree, right? Where you have this spam style build that you can progress towards, or this methodical, slower bleed style build. And both, it seems like right now more than ever, really, you're going to be able to. Of course, there will always be a mathematical best option, and it is likely that the bleed style build is going to be the best option. But you will now have a justification and an actual justifiable reason to go a certain way, and I think the legendaries very much complement that. So I've even looked at using the clear casting one, for example, the one that gives you increased energy and Omen of Clarity is more likely to proc. That one could be really good with, I've thought, a Blood Talons build and a Sabertooth build, where you basically remove the requirement to pool during Blood Talons, which that's the limitation of Blood Talons, is that you spend so much time pooling, really. But now you've just removed that as a factor, so it could be really, really cool. Of course, that would also be complementary to an Incon build. So you have this room for movement with a lot of these legendaries. Of course, there are multiple bleed-based, the Jagged Wounds legendary, and the potency of your bleeds being increased, so Moonfire, Rake, and Rip, if they're on one target, they're increased by 30%. So I think the Jagged Wounds one, and Guilty probably back me up on this, the Jagged Wounds one will in general be the better option, especially as soon as you add one target to that, then suddenly the legendary is useless. So I think in general the Jagged Wounds one would be really good, but I think that's something that buffs Lunar Inspiration and could make Lunar Inspiration a cool talent to kind of bring back into the fray. So in general, I'm very happy with these legendaries. There is one that, and even so, if you go Night Fae and you go Convoke the Spirits and you get the Heart of the Wild one, where every time you shift into your Affinities form, you gain Heart of the Wild. So again, every single time you use Convoke now, you get the benefits of Heart of the Wild. So it could make that massive AoE Starfall Boomkin style pretty fun. I don't think it'll be the best in terms of raw output, but it just makes it really fun. And in things like Torghast, they're going to be really, really good. So I'm very happy with the legendaries. Like I say, I'm happy that they pursued a bleed style build and a spam style build. So we were talking about, that level of complexity associated with Feral, people that aren't as well versed in Feral or don't feel like they've got it in them to do that harder style will still have access to many options. And yeah, I'm happy.
Cool. That's good to hear, because there's a lot of people that aren't very happy with their legendaries. Guilty, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we got good ones.
Guilty, go ahead.
I think we're kind of fortunate. I mentioned earlier that Feral and Balance have very different distributions in terms of damage, in terms of dot damage. So it kind of feels like we have 6 legendaries that are Feral specific as opposed to just 4, because healers and tanks don't exist. I'm sorry, but it's a fact. So the dot value ones kind of feel very Feral tailored. So that's pretty cool. I like dot damage. I think I just saw you mentioned the 30% one versus the Jagged Wounds one.
Which one's the Jagged Wounds that you're referring to? Is it the Rip has 4% chance?
Yeah.
Druid Runecarve 3.
Runecarve.
It's
so it's the Rip has 4% chance. Has a 4% chance to make your next ferocious bite free and deal max damage. That one?
No, it's your damage over time effects deal their damage in 25% less time.
Oh, it's a general one. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Yes, yeah. It's a general one, but it feels very. It's obviously a talent that we used to have, and it doesn't help Balance much because they don't do much dot damage. So that's really interesting gameplay. There's the other one, which is the single target, which is just strictly better than Jagged Wounds one, but only works in single target. But that works fine because obviously you can choose the legendary you want. Obviously, to go more detail in the actual Feral legendary powers we've got, they're actually all based on set bonuses, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah,
I think it's all of the last 4 expansions end tier set bonuses, apart from one which is from BRF instead of HFC. So Apex Predator's Craving is kind of interesting now because. So it's a set bonus, it has the exact same values as our Antorus set bonus. And in Antorus, it wasn't particularly good. It was a pretty small contributor to damage. But we have had changes from then, so now Bite deals significantly more damage. And obviously Sabertooth exists. This synergizes really well with Sabertooth, especially as Onsai mentioned on AoE. So that's kind of cool. I'm a big fan of that. I think that Feral Runecarve 2, which is the Tiger's Fury, causes your next finishing move to restore 3 combo points, has a lot of interesting synergy with Predator and Mythic Plus, and I think that's pretty interesting. And so Druid Ring Hub 4 I mentioned earlier. That's the Incarnation and Berserk cause your combo point generating abilities. Generating in that tooltip is really important to deal bleed damage for 50% of their duration over 8 seconds. So that's our BRF set bonus, but it's been changed. So obviously in BRF it was all damage, and now it's combo point generating abilities. At the moment this doesn't look very good because our combo point generating abilities aren't particularly heavy in our damage profile. So this actually ends up quite far down the line, I think. I think this needs a look at from Blizzard, either to make it all damage or to significantly buff the bleed value, because I don't think at the moment it competes at all.
Or like we said, just make it baseline with Berserk, and it's okay that it's in like a weakened form potentially. I don't know. You'd obviously have to run the numbers on it, but
then we need a new legendary anyway.
Then we need a new legendary. Yeah, true.
So I think this is the main one which needs a lot of look at from Blizzard. And then the last one is the Shadowlands/HFC set bonus combined. So it increases our energy by a significant amount, but also our clear-casted abilities give energy back. So it kind of just feels a bit generic. I don't really have a problem with it. It's more energy for the people who prefer Feral to be a bit faster. And yeah, as a whole, I'm pretty happy with our legendaries. There's some interesting ones. There's some ones that are kind of just okay. Really, the Berserk one is the only one that kind of isn't particularly interesting.
Would you just want to see something completely different on that, or do you think that that's workable with some numbers?
Everything is fixable with tuning.
Well, okay. Within reason, sure, yeah.
Within reason. Personally, I'd prefer if it was just a different legendary.
I don't feel like taking a legendary for Berserk is in a way fair. Like, I just don't like Berserk is so weak that if you make any legendary with Berserk, like buffing Berserk, it has to be either extremely good or it's probably like not going to get taken at all, because Berserk just isn't very good right now. So it's kind of cheap that Blizzard would make it so our Berserk is buffed by a legendary, because that's not really fair. We can only wear one legendary, and like Berserk is just so bad. It's one thing if Berserk was already really good and then you had a legendary, because then it's like, well, how good do we want to make it? But right now it's just not really worth using, so I don't think that's fair. But
yeah, you often run in these kind of situations that you don't want something external needing to fix the core issues on your class.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's certainly it's been a theme so far in every show and just in general. Obviously, people have commented on a lot throughout the years in World of Warcraft. So it's something that desperately needs some attention. Berserk, and I said, I share that pain from a tanking role too. It's really quite crappy. That being said, now that we've kind of overviewed all of the main, kind of meat and bones of Feral and Shadowlands, do any of these systems in Shadowlands tacked on top of the baseline Feral spec really nail home fix some of the issues that we discussed earlier? I'm probably going to be inclined already to say no, because some of the issues were utility based, but what do you guys think? Yeah. Does this help it further along?
As you said, I don't think particularly. I think our issues are utility based, and I don't think obviously these address any utility problems. And we don't even have particularly utility focused legendaries. Even our general legendaries are pretty damage focused. So I don't think this addresses anything. I think they're nice. I think there's some interesting gameplay behind them. I don't think it fixes the actual sort of issue that Feral has.
Side?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think the legend, I think because Feral is memed on so hard, I think a lot of people think that Feral is just broken, and it's just it's got these gaping issues with it, and it really, really doesn't. We've had the question of, should Feral be reworked, and should it get the Shadow Priest treatment? And it really, in my opinion, it really shouldn't, because a rework can end up where you look like Survival Hunter instead of a Shadow Priest, and I think it can be a risky game. But I also feel like Feral doesn't need these massive fixes. It needs a couple outlier things just to be kind of brought in line. And I feel like Berserk being changed is one. and I feel like being brought more in line with Boomkin is another, where getting Trents and Innovate then becomes we want a Druid DPS, not we want specifically a Boomkin. And I think apart from that, I think that's mostly it. And so I think that's what we're really suffering from, is this utility and just general, just bad kind of bad rap that I don't really know why we still have, because Feral is really not as bad as a lot of people say, and that's just it. Like I think Feral, I have people all the time say like, oh, Feral should get like a 20% buff, or do you think it should get like a 15% buff on this and that and that? And I'm like, I really think our stuff is fine. Like our damage seems fine.
A devil's advocate here for a second, by the way.
Yeah,
survival is super fun to play, but
it is. It is.
That aside, well, okay, so we've kind of the next section obviously was desired changes, and we've already discussed the whole, does a generally more difficult DPS, should they be outputting more damage than the easier to play or lower skill cap? Been over that. We talked about, I think we're all in the same boat here, that Feral's issue is not a core gameplay thing. They don't need a complete overhaul. They seem to be in a relatively good spot, according to both of you, and from what I've been reading in chat as well. It's really just this massive, just overshadowing of utility, both intra and interclass. So like within, versus balance, but then also versus other competing melee players in, frankly, a world where we just don't really have room for a melee roster, right? There's so many melee specs competing for 3 to 5 spots on average in Mythic rating. So that's certainly part of the issue. So then let's step back a second because of what you just mentioned and dive a bit into the nitty-gritty before we get to getting a couple questions. Community perception, right? In some of the other shows that we've had, it was easy to ask, guys like Shadow and Windwalker, well, why do you think Blizzard's so slow to address your changes? Why is it taking so long to fix Windwalker bugs and the Shadow Priest issue with Void Form? But that doesn't really apply here, right? Because it doesn't seem that what you guys have been waiting for I don't know how many years or months has been anything really to do with your core rotation and gameplay. Rather, why do you think then, I suppose, they're so hesitant to give you a utility that stands out or that at least mirrors somebody else so you can bring them in?
I can jump on that. I genuinely think that, so this is kind of like an out there kind of a thought process that I have, but I feel like for Blizzard to balance 36 specs to be all within 1% effectiveness of one another for all different types of content is kind of like in just unrealistic, right? And I actually genuinely feel like the balancing issue of Blizzard, like I feel like Blizzard do a reasonably good job at balancing. Like there is a 6.3k Feral Druid. Feral Druids are doing 26, 27 keys, whatever, right? Like, and higher. Most specs in the game, like I guarantee that every single spec in the game could do at least a 25 key. And that is the extreme limits of like Mythic Plus, right? And in terms of rating, I mean, in terms of, I guess you compare it to World First rating compared to, I guess, just more general rating. But I mean, I've played in top 1,000 guilds and whatnot, and when we're progressing, it's not an issue that I'm on a Feral. It's an issue that we're dying to the same mechanic over and over again because people play in Dum Dum. So I don't think that the specs are necessarily the issue, but I think that Blizzard has probably like split the Druid specs into different regions, and I feel like they just see Feral Druid as a PvP spec. Things like Feral Frenzy would make that more evident, where I feel that they just look at us as like Feral's place is PvP. It's not really supposed to be in PvE, right? And I don't think that that's necessarily the right call, but I also know that, I mean, you were telling me earlier, Sloop, to be a little bit more selfish with my opinions, but
oh, it's fine. Yeah.
I think that it's okay that Feral isn't the strongest. I think it's okay that Boomkin is like the raid spec, Resto's the Mythic Plus spec, Guardian's just desirable in all of those things because it's a tank, and tanks are in huge demand because of their role. Not many people want to do it, right? So I see you making faces, but like obviously there are more desirable tanks. But like, I mean, look at Tomo. Like Tomo's like what, 6k something monster tank. Like
you're absolutely right. Guardian falls in the same category if you can do the content and high content in Guardian. I agree for sure.
Yeah. So I feel like they've kind of split it all up and then gone, oh, and Feral's the PvP spec, and that doesn't necessarily that Feral is the best spec in the game at PvP, but it just means like that's where each of these specs I feel excel in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's okay that Feral isn't like, because if you ask if you had people on and you spoke to people, every single person would say, oh, well, my spec should be the most OP in everything. And like, that's just not like, people need to move away from that idea. And I think people need to move away from this idea of like perfection and just be more open to, like, not like, you're not as good as you think you are kind of thing. Right. And like, neither am I, neither are you, neither is the other guy. Like, you don't always need perfection. And I feel like Feral is actually in a perfectly fine spot. I don't think it really needs anything. Like I say, it needs Trents and Innovate just to even us out a little bit with Boomkin. And that's like really it, you know?
Is that the direction you'd want to see them head in, though? Like giving equal utility to Boomkin, or do you want to see them head more in a competitive other melee direction, like we mentioned, giving them 5% physical debuff?
Well, I feel like we won't
Or
ever. So the 5%, like taking leader of the pack, I think would help us in raid, but I don't necessarily think it would guarantee us a spot. But of course, if everyone else has a buff, like Windwalker has one, I think Rhett has one now, right? Shaman have one, or Enhance has one, DKs have one now, etc., etc. Warriors have one. So now that everyone kind of has one, I think it's literally Survival and Feral that are like the only melee specs in the game that don't bring a buff. So I guess you may as well throw it in just to even us out with everybody. But I think our competitor, so I think our competitors in Mythic Plus are Resto Druid because they bring the same utility that we do, but better.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a Resto Druid in the group, the only advantage you have as a Feral is you have a single target stun. You have the ability to go and deal with a lot of the stealth mechanics, whilst the Resto may still be required or potentially not. We also have good control, so like the Maggot, for example, in Underart, we can control that Maggot, we can hibernate it, and if you time it well, then you can just deal with that no problem. And so we can be that kind of control guy. We have Rake from stealth stuns target, and then we have Maim, and then we have, I guess, like other various things just to help with the control. But if you have a Resto and an Outlaw in your group, then there's no reason to bring a Feral. I think Outlaw takes a lot of people's group spots when it comes to Mythic Plus. So I feel like the only way that Feral is then going to be super competitive is if Outlaw Rogue or Rogue in general is severely handicapped. And I don't see, like, I think it's a weird world. Again, this is where I'm being selfless. Is I think it's a weird world when a Feral Druid is better than a Rogue. Because, like, I go back to Classic WoW, and I think, like, Rogue was the Rogue, and Feral was like a gimped Rogue. Boomkin was a gimped Mage. Resto was a gimped Priest. Guardian was a gimped Warrior, right? Like, that's how it was. And I don't necessarily think that the game should go back to that, but I just think it's kind of weird, because at least if you're a Feral and your spec is kind of, like, in the dirt, at least you could say, oh, well, I still love being a Druid. I still love being a Night Fae. I love all my pretty colors and my purples and whatnot and my flowers. I'm going to go play Boomkin, and it's fine. Or I'm going to go play Resto. Like, you have multiple... You can play ranged, you can play tank, you can play healer. Like, you can literally go into any other facet of the game and still play your favorite character that you know and love and have got all this stuff on. But if you're a rogue, and let's say like Outlaw Rogue is the best rogue spec in the game, and let's say it's like the worst melee, right? Where do you go from there? Like, you just have to re-roll that character because there is no alternative. You are a melee DPSer. You don't have any room for movement. And I know a lot of people fight me on this point and they say, but I'm not a Druid, I'm a Feral. And I get that. But Blizzard, it's easier for Blizzard to balance around 12 classes than it is to play to balance around 36 specs. And if you're really that caught up around like, but I'm a Feral, then it doesn't matter that you're not very good because you're so committed to Feral. Like, you either care more about being Feral or being invited. And if you care more about being in Feral, then you'll stay Feral because you like it. And if you don't, then you'll re-roll to the meta spec because it gets invited. But
interesting take. I mean, obviously what Feral players want is both, right? They want to be invited while playing the spec that they desire. But like, I understand what you're saying. It's very hard to balance 36
But everybody
specs.
wants that. And yeah.
Sure,
I would
sure.
really quick just kind of jump on and say a couple of things that I think we haven't discussed yet that I think Feral really needs is, like, this is a whole Druid problem where Druid just, like, Blizzard doesn't have a consistency, right? Like, as a Feral, you can hibernate in cat form, but you can't Cyclone, and you can't Battle Res in cat form. And it's just like this really
the
weird
shapeshift issue.
Yeah, but Boom can, or like Guardian can res in bear form.
Correct.
and it's just like they need a uniform. Like I don't mind Cyclone having a cast time or Battle Res having a cast time, but don't make me change spec like every time. And it's just like a really weird thing. But I just wanted to kind of add that on.
Yeah, some shape-shifting stuff can certainly have a look at.
Yeah.
So then, really, how do we, in your guys' opinions, and we'll start with you, Guilty, here. How do we, so from the Blizzard side, a couple of potentially easy fixes with utility, right, that we've mentioned. How do we fix community perception and this addiction to the meta that doesn't resonate anywhere beyond, like a very, very small percentage high crowd or high performing group? How do we fix the, I'm a 5K, 6K, whatever, feral, I'm going to pug, but these guys are rejecting me because I'm a feral? Guilty.
So firstly, I think people need to accept that some content isn't pug content, unfortunately. But to feral specifically, if you give us innovate, you make innovate part of the balanced affinity choice. Maybe you change the value of stampeding raw. So obviously Guardian has more valuable stampeding raw. Honestly, you get rid of raid buffs. You remove all raid buffs from everyone, and suddenly it doesn't matter that feral doesn't have a raid buff. So I mean, that's what I would like Blizzard to do personally. That's what I think they should do. I think it's healthier for the game for raid buffs not to exist. I think it is hard to change feral, and I don't agree with a lot of what Sai just said. One thing I do agree
Many people don't agree with me. Actually, I'm looking at chat. People are angry, and I knew they would be.
But a lot of the point he made about feral in particular kind of resonates with truth, in that I don't think it is possible to have all 36 raid specs in a 20-man raid. And somebody can check my maths on that, but I'm pretty confident that those two numbers don't fit together. So at the end of the day, you can't... And they can give feral something that makes it mandatory. I do not give a shit. I will play, and I will take my free mandatory raid spot, and I will enjoy it. But I don't think it is good for the game probably to make ferals mandatory for raid groups. As we mentioned earlier, I think that they should split up. I think they should remove raid buffs, first of all. If they don't remove raid buffs, I think they should share out raid buffs. So maybe feral has the same buff as rest, as warrior, or as DH, or as monk, and then it's bring the player, not the class. Maybe that's what they do. But I think the main thing that Blizzard should do is put innovate and balance affinity, make half the wild baseline, and that brings our desirability pretty similar to Boomkin. And I think that goes a long way to solving issues in general, beyond larger system-wide issues. I don't think Blizzard are ever going to fix the meta obsession, because
no, they can't.
I think that's human nature.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think that's something that's actually fixable, and to change, in my opinion, to change perception of the community, what needs to happen is, frankly, feral needs to get overpowered for like a tier, and then it'll catch people's attention, just like with Prot Warrior, like it happened earlier in BFA, and then they'll go, oh wow, feral. But if they just work around slightly bouncing feral, making them slightly more desirable, I just don't think it'll do the trick with how obsessed the community is with the meta.
Yes. Really, in order to change community perception, you need to be wildly overpowered.
And Blizzard are aware of that. Yeah. And this is the thing, right? The reason I say that we need to innovate in trends, and this is exactly on that argument, is this is from a Mythic Plus perspective. I mean, obviously trends are pretty useless in a raid environment, but and by the way, if you think, but it doesn't fit in the lore for feral to have trends, it's okay. We can have an army of small cats or something. I know people like that idea. That'll definitely score me brownie points with people out there. But if you go into Mythic Plus, right, and at the beginning of an expansion, your tanks don't have a whole lot of gear. They don't have a whole lot of legendaries. They're not going to have their ranked up of conduits and all that kind of stuff. Their soulbinds unlocked. They're going to be squishy. It's going to be a dangerous time for tanks, right? You're also going to have healers that don't have the secondary stats they need for proficient healing. So they're going to probably go because they got to pump a lot more heals and a lot more spells into healing everyone, right? Plus, people are new to mechanics. They're going to be standing in a bunch of stuff. They're going to be taking unnecessary damage, which later down the line, they will stop doing, hopefully. So Innovate becomes very strong because your healer needs that mana regen, right? So what you do is you give Trent and Innovate to Feral very quickly in the or like going into Shadowlands. So the first season of Mythic Plus, you go, oh yeah, we can bring Feral because they bring trends, they can bring Innovate. The community leans on Feral/Boomkin for those things. Eventually, you get to a point where the community realizes, like, you get to a point where those things stop being good. Tanks no longer need trends because they just learn to kite. Healers like actually know how to heal, and people know how to avoid things. So Innovate falls off, trends fall off, but people have forgotten why they needed those things. They just know that those things are good to have. So the community doesn't realize why it isn't good before, like, way later than it stops being good. Like, I think Boomkin stopped being taken to Mythic Plus like 8.3, right? It was like not required, I think, way earlier than that, in my opinion. So there's like that delayed effect. And so by that time, well, they're just used to us being there. So they just go, oh yeah, Feral's good, right? Yeah, I think Feral's good. Like, I get people that still go, oh, Feral's bad. I remember playing with it like at BFA launch, and it's like, dude, we've changed a lot since then. So people's perception will linger for a long time, and that is my that's what my
your 5-head play
is bringing those in. That's my 5-head play, is to trick the community into thinking we're better than we actually are. Yeah.
All right, gents, we're running a bit short on time, and we've covered everything we need. So let's take a couple of questions here. Chat, we're definitely not going to get through everything. And if it's something that's been covered in the show and you joined kind of halfway through the show or anything like that, I'm not going to pick it, because you can just go watch the VOD. So we'll try to get through what we can, because I know, well, all of us pretty much, I think we need to head off to raid testing. So question for QA. It seems Blizzard's intention is that every spec has a niche that is, wow, I really want X spec for this. What is Feral's niche, or what do they think it should be? Like, what is it that Feral has as a high point from a niche perspective? Guilty. Well then.
Historically, it's been single target damage. At the moment, I don't think we have a particular niche. It's not really a thing.
You agree with that, Zai?
Yeah, like, it's kind of weird that Feral Druid is better than Boomkin in AoE, but worse in single target, and Boomkin, who summons like moons and stars, is worse in AoE but better on single target. Like, those two should be swapped. But yeah, traditionally, yeah, our niche was single target and whatnot. Now every other spec in our class can do what we can do and more. And we don't really have any like, rogues can do what we do better. So we don't really have a niche, and I think that is exactly kind of the problem.
Okay. Favorite artifact skin?
Oh, nature's the one that looks like a tree. It's literally my whole thing. It's like my whole life I built around it. What's it called? You'll know, Guilty. Nature's
I don't
Fury.
know, because you're wrong. It's the shiny purple one.
No. Because the shiny purple one, people know that you're a feral, so they see you and they kick you before you can get into, like, before you can
Not next expansion.
So yeah, next expansion is going to be better, but you wear this one because it still looks really good, but people don't know that you're feral because it kind of looks just like the normal bland one. And also, you can get a t-shirt. What's it called? It's called a irradiated undercoat from Mechagon, and it makes it look way cooler because it gives it even more green glow. Boom, done.
All right.
Okay, you're still wrong, and it's the shiny purple one.
Shiny purple one, official name as well. What do you think about recombining Guardian and Feral back into one spec and giving Druids three baseline specs again?
I think it's an awful idea.
Better get used to tanking, I guess, right? Better get warmed up, because we would not be DPSing. I
don't think it. I think it worked in the history of when you could choose like talents in the old sense. I don't think it would work now at all. I think it would be a mess.
Yeah, I think the game plays differently now. Like if your druid has to jump into bear form, pop Heart of the Wild, and like, hey, I'm the tank now. Well, first of all, if there are 10 mobs and your tank's dead, then you've already wiped. Like, the run's over because the mage is taking aggro, then the hunter's taking aggro, and like blah blah blah, and like you're just dead. Or if you're like on a boss and your tank dies, like, just reset and go again, dude. Like,
I think it would either be awful or it would be wildly overpowered.
Yeah, like
those are the only two.
Don't really exist anymore, I guess, as much. So yeah, I don't think that's probably the best idea. But
Why does the level 45 talent row not work? I know we went in pretty ham on the level 45, so we don't need to reiterate everything, but the reasoning here is the two arguments given were more skill required provides more DPS, and there should be an easier option on the talent row. It seems to me that this makes the 45 row look perfect as an AoE-focused row.
Was our conclusion that the 45 row didn't work?
Well, you guys didn't like Scent of Blood.
I think Scent of Blood is...
Yeah.
Scent of Blood is a problematic talent because it's the same niche as Primal Wrath. It does the same thing. So it just results in a situation where you pick the one which does the higher numbers. Apart from that, I think the row works fine. I think Sai wanted a single target talent there.
Well, there's just literally no point to take Scent of Blood, and my point was just if you included... Like, if you buff Scent of Blood so that it's better than Primal Wrath, then you take Scent of Blood. And then Primal Wrath isn't taken. So, like, it doesn't fix anything. There's just always going to be a dead talent on that row.
It just needs to be a different AoE talent.
It just needs to be, like, different in some sense where, like maybe if you were constantly in just, like, a 4-target situation where you might be like, ooh, I want to rake everything, but, like, Primal Wrath isn't quite stronger than if I raked everything or something like that. But, like, then that just gets into a small target, medium target, mass AoE. And, like, that's all it would be. But, yeah.
Thoughts on feral mobility? I know we have increased baseline movement speed, but
it's insane.
But does cat need a talent to be able to leap? Do you think wild charge should be baseline?
I hate wild charge baseline. I think it's reasonably iconic. I don't think we need the additional mobility though. We've got 150% base movement speed.
Is it 30?
Yeah, I exclusively use Tiger Dash because it's insane, and anybody that uses wild charge, that's fine because I respect your opinion. You're allowed to play what you want. But I think that we already have like a charge in our Skull Bash, which in our interrupt, which can actually be really annoying, like second boss of Shrine, where you go to take your interrupt and it doesn't work because you're on top of the platform, or you charge through like a whirlwind and you're just like, okay, well that's cool, or tornado, and you're like, okay, cool. So I still think it should stay that way though. Like it's really good as a gap closer. So you just use Tiger Dash and Skull Bash, and you can literally go from like, I don't know, like 60 yards back, and you're just there. So our movement speed is absolutely insane, actually.
Thoughts on adding Lunar Guardian to Feral?
What is Lunar Guardian? That's
the Guardian talent, yeah, with the Moonfire, where you get like a proc for an empowered Moonfire.
Yeah, he means really galactic. Good. He means Galactic Guardian, and it's basically 5% chance to proc a free Moonfire on the target from any damage, including bleed ticks.
I don't know if he means replacing Lunar Inspiration or in addition to. I think that it would basically fulfill the same function as Lunar Inspiration. I don't think it would particularly change anything versus just playing Lunar Inspiration.
It would be cool. It would empower the idea of using Moonfire, but like, yeah, is that instead of Lunar Inspiration or as well as? It depends on what.
Then it would be very weird. Because we'd have 2 talents for Moonfire.
It would be cool though, like if it procced on like bleeds and stuff, and you Primal Wrath thrash everything, and then like just 10 times, like you see these Moonfires just like proccing up everywhere or something, like that could be cool. But I think it could be probably a balancing issue, maybe.
I just don't think it.
I don't think it'd be very good. Yeah,
it is fun to see on Guardian, by the way, when it happens. But
yeah, it is fun.
Oh, don't! I've played more Guardian than I wish I'd played Guardian. So tell me that.
What about a redesign without combo points and energy, and instead a rage-like builder spender in brackets faster, more cat-like gameplay? So like a resource redesign, basically, to a basic builder spender.
I very much hate it.
I very much hate it. You seem like you're trying to be polite with that. I don't know.
If I wanted to play a raged spec, then I'd be playing Warrior. Is basically where I'd go with that.
Yeah, like I say, our origin is we were a gimped rogue in Classic, and that is how we should always we're energy, right? Like we're just energy. It makes sense with combo points. It makes sense. Because if you used energy, it just like would be so weird with using generators. You know, it'd just be very strange. So,
just a couple more here before we wrap up. Actually, you maybe indirectly answer this, but if Feral got removed / let's say it was just so bad you couldn't play it for competitive reasons or whatever, what would be your next line in spec in line? Where would you play?
Probably Rogue. My guild likes to joke that Feral Druids are ROP, which means Rogue on Progress. So probably Rogue. I really like how Assassination plays, actually. Assassination plays really, really cool on live. I think it's honestly probably a more interesting bleed spec than Feral.
Yep, I agree.
So
It feels
Rogue,
more fun to play.
Maybe Windwalker, actually. I really liked Windwalker and Antorus. I actually temporarily main swapped to Windwalker and Antorus.
See, I was going to say Windwalker, but then I watched J-Funk and Babylonius talk about Windwalker the other day, and then I decided that I never want to play Windwalker ever again.
Don't get me wrong. I love Babs dearly.
They scared me out of ever playing Windwalker again. No, I think Windwalker... Right now, oh god, I'm like... It's disgusting. Right now, I'm on live, I play Windwalker, Enhancement Shaman, and Survival Hunter. And I'm looking at probably taking all or one of those through to Shadowlands. So I'm really creating a name for myself as like a scuffed melee main. So yeah, probably one of those. I also really like, I like Rogue. I like Assassination. And I also
all shit specs on principle.
I just enjoy these specs. They just happen to be bad. Maybe I am the reason they're bad. I don't know. But yeah, something like that is good. Mm-hmm.
Oh, thanks, chat.
Mm-hmm.
All right, last two here. In your opinion, how big is the nerf of Balance Affinity going from 5 to 3 yards? Is it irrelevant, or do you think that causes a problem?
I mean, we've played with it for 3 yards for the last expansion. I don't know if this person knows, but it was changed in Legion.
Yeah.
BFA. So yeah, I don't think it matters. I think Balance Affinity is still the best.
It would be a problem if they removed it entirely, though, because I don't know if you've played Feral like extensively and you get used to that increased range, and like you go on like a third boss of Freehold, the Sharky Boy, and you can stand outside of his Whirlwind and like still attack and stuff, and there's really big benefits. But then you'll go and log on an ult, like say Windwalker or something, and you forget that like you forget how close you are to the mobs. So you'll be pressing your buttons for a while, and then you just realize after like 10 seconds that you haven't actually been close enough to attack the mob, and you're like, oh, okay.
Why you gotta use Windwalker in your example, man? They already got enough problems right now.
Why
do you add more?
sorry, Windwalker. I play one, dude. I play one.
Or rogues. Or Windwalkers.
All right. Last question. Last question here. What do you think about MAME functioning as a gouge, so it brings it closer to rogue utility?
Yeah,
I agree that MAME needs some changes. I think the fact that it consumes combo points is extremely yikes. So I'm entirely up for that. I think that's a good change.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of crazy that, like, so Rogue and Demon Hunter, not only do they have some of the best utility and most unique utility in the game, but they also have the best variation of that utility. So, like, there are multiple things in the game that have ink cap, for example, but, like, Rogue is the shortest cooldown of an ink cap. So, like, things like that, I think that would bring us closer in line with Rogues. And, like I say, Feral already fulfills the role of control, so in Underrot, dealing with maggots and interrupting and stuff like that. So if you have that gouge potential, like in the form of MAME, then I think that'd be really strong. That'd be really good.
All right, gents. I mean, we could sit here talking all day and night about this. This show's gone on even longer than Windwalker, which is fine. It's good, but we got to get to raid testing. So, but importantly, before we go, do you guys, basically, final thoughts, leaving thoughts. Guilty, why don't we start with you? Leaving thoughts about, could be Feral, could be towards Blizzard, could be towards community, could be personal desires, whatever it may be, just final thoughts here.
I think, yeah, I'm pretty happy with Feral. I think people have been extremely negative in general this beta cycle. So hopefully people can...
Towards Feral or generally, do you mean?
Just in general. And I've been part of this as well, but like, in Feral in particular, the Feral community has just been the biggest like persecution complex I've ever experienced. It's been kind of wild. People have just been extremely negative. So people just need to learn to just maybe look a little bit more positively, especially when Blizzard have done a lot of shit stuff this beta cycle, but they've also done some good stuff. So we can try and recognize the good stuff when they do it. And yeah, that's it. Feral looks good. I'm reasonably happy. Ketsuki has messaged me and says I'm not negative. Demon Hunter needs love. So Blizzard, look at Demon Hunter.
Yeah, give him a once over.
Yeah, everyone loves them very much. Sai?
I'm going to be lynched for that one.
Yeah, I mean, my closing thoughts are, I don't hate Feral. I know a lot of you in chat probably think I do based on my opinions, but I'm just trying to be realistic. I obviously want Feral to be strong, but I also am aware that it probably isn't going to be, and I think that's okay, because if you really enjoy it, you should still be playing it. And going into Shadowlands, Feral feels good. It's not necessarily going to be a meta spec, but I still think it's looking fun, it's looking interesting. And yeah, just play it if you're enjoying it, and if not, then yeah, go like play meta or whatever, and it's all good too, as long as you're enjoying the game. And I wanted to thank you, Sloot, for having us on and just like doing these chats and everything. It's been amazing. Sure. And just one final thing for chat, I just wanted to say thanks for getting involved with a lot of this. And do we have any prime gamers in chat for Sloot at all? Do we have any prime gamers? Unless you wanted to.
I'll give you the $10 for that later.
Yeah. No.
All right, guys, it's been a pleasure. Definitely looking. Well, I definitely hope that you guys get. It doesn't really seem like an overwhelming amount of issues, but you guys do get the issues addressed, and they take a good look. Honestly, just from a meta perspective, in my opinion, they take a good look at some of the unique buffs and debuffs that are brought to raid. So I hope that happens for you. Definitely curious to catch up with you guys if that happens and hear your thoughts again. Otherwise, let's do this again sometime. And guys, thank you very much, and have fun in raid testing.
Hey, enjoy the subs, man. You're welcome.
You get a 10% managerial cut.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
All right, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys. Their chat, all their social is up there, so make sure you check these guys out. Hit them a follow on Twitter. Great dudes, and hopefully Feral has. I felt like we came out with definitely some brighter notes out of Feral here than the kind of, to a certain extent, detriment and worry and negativity that existed in the Windwalker talk. So I hope they get some attention for sure. But looks like Feral's not too badly off right now. Community perception and all that.